Welcome, traveller of the quiet. You have arrived here not by accident but by longing. Something in you recognized the call, sensed the invitation, felt the pull toward this sacred space where the world's demands grow dim and another reality becomes visible. Traveller of the quiet, not the loud, not the restless, not the constantly busy. You are one who knows that something essential lives in the spaces between the noise. You are one who has learned or is learning that the soul needs silence the way the body needs air. Tonight we step away from noise, not to escape the world, but to hear what has always waited beneath it. This is not retreat. This is not avoidance. This is not running from responsibility or hiding from reality. This is stepping away intentionally, purposefully, with the courage it takes to stop when everything around you insists you must keep moving. From noise, not just the audible kind, but all the clamour that fills our days. The mental noise of endless decisions. The emotional noise of unprocessed pain. The spiritual noise of demands and expectations, and the constant pressure to perform. Not to escape the world. The world is still there. Its needs are real. Its pain is genuine. Its brokenness requires our engagement. But to hear what has always waited beneath it, there is something deeper than the surface chaos. Something older than today's crisis. Something truer than the latest urgent thing demanding your attention. It has always been there, waiting, patient, constant, beneath the noise, beneath the rush, beneath the fear and striving. It waits still. This is a story for the night, for the heart that wonders where God has gone when heaven seems mute. Night is when questions feel heavier, when doubts grow louder, when the distractions of day can no longer drown out the ache in your soul. For the heart that wonders, not the heart that has all the answers, not the heart that pretends to be fine, but the wondering heart, the questioning heart, the honest heart that admits when it cannot feel what it once felt, cannot hear what it once heard clearly. Where God has gone when heaven seems mute. You have prayed and heard nothing. You have cried out and been met with silence. You have searched for signs and found only absence. Heaven seems mute, not angry, not punishing, just quiet, unresponsive, empty. And in that seeming emptiness, you wonder, has he left? Does he hear? Does he care? But silence is not absence, it is invitation. This changes everything. What if the quiet is not God turning away, but God drawing you deeper? What if the silence is not rejection, but an invitation to something you could never access in the noise? Silence is not absence. The two feel similar. Both involve not hearing what you expect to hear, but they are utterly different in nature and purpose. Absence is void. Invitation is fullness waiting to be entered. It is the language of the one who speaks in stillness. God has many languages. He speaks through scripture, through creation, through circumstances, through other people. But his native tongue, his most intimate language, is stillness, the one who speaks in stillness, not because he lacks power to speak loudly, but because some truths can only be whispered. Some revelations can only be received in quiet. Some encounters can only happen when everything else has fallen away. Close your eyes now, let the world fall away and listen. This is the invitation. Not to think harder, not to try harder, not to figure out the answers. Close your eyes, shut out the visual distractions, the endless input, the constant stimulation. Let the world fall away, not forever, not permanently, but for this moment. Allow it to recede, to blur, to become less urgent, and listen. Not with your ears only, but with your whole being. Listen with your heart. Listen with your spirit. Listen with the part of you that knows how to recognize truth, even when it comes without words. There is a kind of speech that does not use words, a conversation written in pauses, in wind moving through branches, in the hush that follows prayer. We are so trained to equate communication with words. We think if there are no words, there is no message. But there is a kind of speech that does not use words, more ancient, more primal, more true. A conversation reel, two-way, intimate communication. Written in pauses, the spaces between sounds hold meaning. The silence between sentences carries weight. In wind moving through branches, the natural world participating in the conversation, speaking what words cannot capture. In the hush that follows prayer. After you have spoken all you can speak, after your words have run out, after you have poured out everything in your heart, there is a hush. It is not emptiness. It is not God ignoring you. It is the sacred space where response becomes possible, where listening becomes real, where communion happens beyond the limits of language. Long before we learned to talk, creation understood it. Human language is recent in the cosmic timeline, but communication is ancient. Long before we learned to talk, before humans developed speech, before words were formed, before vocabulary existed, creation understood it. The language of silence, the speech without words, the communication that happens in being, not just in saying. The stars kept it, the oceans practiced it, the mountains stood still and learned to breathe in rhythm with eternity. The stars kept it, maintained it, preserved it, continued to speak in the original language, shining without words, declaring glory without sentences. The oceans practiced it, the rhythm of waves, the depth of currents, the vast waters communicating something profound without uttering a sound. The mountains stood still and learned to breathe in rhythm with eternity. They didn't rush, they didn't panic. They stood and stood and stood, inhaling and exhaling with the same breath that sustains all creation, moving to a rhythm far slower and deeper than our frantic pace. Silence was the first temple, and God filled it with himself. Before any building was erected, before any structure was dedicated, before Solomon's temple or the tabernacle in the wilderness, there was silence. And it was the first temple, not a place but a condition, not a structure but a state of being, and God filled it with himself, not because the silence was empty and needed filling, but because silence is the proper dwelling place for his presence. In the beginning, before God spoke, "Let there be light," there was silence, and God was there, filling it, dwelling in it, being himself in it, but we forgot. Somewhere along the way we lost this ancient knowledge. We forgot that silence is sacred. We forgot that stillness is where God dwells. We forgot how to be quiet and how to listen, and how to simply be in his presence without agenda or words. We forgot not all at once, but gradually. First one generation, then another, until the memory grew dim and the practice became foreign. We built cities, filled them with sound, and called it progress. Civilization required noise, we thought. Cities meant constant activity, perpetual motion, endless sound. We built them bigger and louder, and we were proud. We filled them with sound deliberately, intentionally. Music and traffic and conversation and machinery, and the hum of 1,000 things all happening at once, and called it progress. We measured advancement by volume, success by activity, growth by how much we could do, and how loudly we could do it. We learned to fill every gap with motion, every pause with music, every moment with noise, because we feared what we might hear if the world grew quiet. This is the deeper truth. It wasn't just preference for noise, it was fear of quiet. We learned to fill every gap because gaps felt dangerous. Empty space felt threatening, with motion always moving, always doing, always busy. Every pause with music background noise constantly playing, filling space that might otherwise allow thoughts or feelings we don't want to face. Every moment with noise podcasts, television, social media, anything to avoid the silence, because we feared what we might hear if the world grew quiet. If all the noise stopped, what would rise up from within? What pain might we have to face? What questions might we have to answer? What loneliness might we have to feel? What guilt, what grief, what longing might emerge? So we keep the noise going, keep the distractions running, keep anything playing that will drown out what the silence might reveal. Yet the voice of God still speaks where everything else ceases. Despite our noise, despite our avoidance, despite our fear, the voice of God still speaks, not has spoken in the past, not will speak in the future, still speaks present tense, active, ongoing, where everything else ceases in the one place we've been avoiding, in the quiet we've been fleeing, in the stillness we've been afraid to enter. There, precisely there, his voice continues. He has not stopped, we have stopped listening. The problem is not on his end. He has not stopped speaking, caring, being present, offering himself. The silence is not his withdrawal. It is our deafness. We've stopped listening. We've trained ourselves not to hear. We've buried his voice under layers of noise and distraction and constant activity. Not because he fell silent, but because we can no longer distinguish his voice from all the other sounds competing for our attention. The ancients knew this. They understood something we've forgotten. The desert fathers and mothers, the prophets who withdrew to mountains, the mystics who sought solitude, the contemplatives who built their lives around silence. They knew this not as theory, but as lived experience. They had discovered the secret we keep losing. They withdrew to mountains and deserts not to be alone, but to remember how to listen. The withdrawal was purposeful. Mountains and deserts, places where human noise is minimal, where natural silence is profound, where the ordinary distractions cannot reach, not to be alone. Solitude was not the goal. Isolation was not the point, but to remember how to listen. They had to unlearn the deafness that civilization produces. They had to retrain their spiritual ears. They had to create space and silence and stillness until they could hear again what the noise had drowned out. For in silence you begin to hear the true nature of all things, not the echo of your own thoughts, but the heartbeat of creation itself. This is what happens when you persist in silence long enough. At first you hear your own thoughts, the mental chatter, the worries, the plans, the memories, the endless internal monologue. But if you stay, if you don't flee back to noise, if you keep sitting in the silence, you begin to hear the true nature of all things, not the echo of your own thoughts, not your own voice bouncing back at you, but the heartbeat of creation itself, the pulse underneath everything, the rhythm that sustains all life, the song that everything is singing together. When the noise fades, your soul begins to echo heaven's rhythm again. Your soul was made to resonate with heaven, created to vibrate at the frequency of God's love, designed to beat in time with eternity's heart. But the noise disrupts that. The constant input throws off the rhythm. The endless demands create dissonance. When the noise fades not instantly but gradually, as you create silence and dwell in it, your soul begins to echo heaven's rhythm again, to remember its true song, to find its natural tempo, to harmonize with the music of the spheres. It is in the spaces between thoughts, between breaths, between prayers, that God often enters. We think God arrives in the big moments, the obvious times, the designated prayer sessions. But it is in the spaces between the gaps we usually rush past, The pauses we typically fill. Between thoughts in that microsecond before one thought ends and another begins, there is a space. Between breaths, the moment of suspension after exhale before inhale. Between prayers when you've said what you had to say and haven't yet begun the next petition. That God often enters, not always, not only, but often, in the unguarded moments, in the unscripted spaces, in the gaps we didn't plan for. He slips in quietly without announcement, and suddenly you become aware he is here. He has been here all along. The silence that feels empty is full of him. This is the great reversal. What feels empty is full. What appears to be nothing contains everything. The silence that feels empty, devoid of sound, absent of activity, seemingly barren, is full of him. Not partially, not somewhat, full, completely filled with his presence. You just haven't learned yet to perceive him there. The waiting that feels endless is the very soil where faith grows. Every season of waiting feels too long. Every period of unanswered prayer feels eternal. But the waiting that feels endless, that seems to stretch on without resolution, without relief, without the answer you've been seeking, is the very soil where faith grows. Not despite the waiting, but through it. Not in spite of the delay, but because of it. Faith doesn't grow in immediate answers. It grows in learning to trust when you cannot see, to hope when you cannot feel, to believe when circumstances argue otherwise. We learn not to demand answers, but to dwell in presence. This is the maturation of faith. Young faith demands answers, wants explanations, requires proof, insists on understanding. But we learn through silence, through waiting, through persisting when God seems quiet, not to demand answers. The answers often don't come. The explanations frequently remain hidden, but something better becomes available. To dwell in presence. Not the presence you can prove or the presence you can feel, but the presence that is more real than feelings, more constant than circumstances, more true than your ability to perceive it. Sometimes God's silence is not withholding, it is forming. We interpret silence as God holding back what we need, refusing to give us what we've asked for, keeping from us what would help. But sometimes, often, perhaps God's silence is not withholding, it is forming. Like an artist working on a sculpture, shaping what cannot yet be seen. Like a writer crafting a story, developing what is not yet ready to be revealed. God is forming something in the silence, in you, through you, for you. Like a seed beneath the ground, something holy happens unseen. The seed in the ground appears dead. Nothing is happening. All is dark and quiet and still. But something holy happens unseen. Germination, transformation, the breaking of the shell, the sprouting of roots, the gathering of strength for the breaking through. All of it invisible, all of it silent, all of it essential. The earth must stay still for roots to grow deep. If the earth were constantly being disturbed, constantly being dug up to check progress, roots could never establish. The earth must stay still, undisturbed, unchanging, patiently holding the seed, for roots to grow deep. Surface roots make weak plants. Deep roots make strong ones. But deep roots require time, stillness, the patience to let the invisible work complete itself. The heart must rest for grace to take shape. Your heart too must rest. Stop striving. Stop performing. Stop trying to manufacture the outcome. For grace to take shape, to form itself, to become visible, to manifest in your life. Grace works in rest, not in effort. It shapes itself in surrender, not in control. It takes form when you finally stop and let God be God. The silence of God is not punishment, it is the sound of preparation. When you cannot hear him, When he seems absent, when the heavens appear closed, this is not punishment for your failures. This is not divine rejection. The silence of God is not punishment. It is the sound of preparation. Something is being readied. Someone is being prepared. Either the answer is being formed, or you are being formed to receive it. Either way, the silence is purposeful, not punitive. And if you sit long enough in that stillness, you begin to hear the difference between the silence of absence and the silence of intimacy. They sound the same at first. Both are quiet. Both involve not hearing what you expected. But if you sit long enough, if you don't flee, if you don't give up, if you keep showing up to the silence, you begin to hear the difference, to sense it, to know it in your bones, between the silence of absence and the silence of intimacy. One feels cold, the other alive. The silence of absence is cold, empty, barren, void. It has the chill of a room no one has entered, the deadness of space unoccupied. The other, alive, warm, present, full. It has the warmth of someone sitting beside you without speaking, the fullness of love that needs no words. The first is despair, the second is awe. The silence of absence leads to despair, the hopelessness of believing no one is there, no one cares, no one is coming. The second is awe, the breathless wonder of being in the presence of the holy, the reverent quietness that comes when you suddenly realize you are not alone. You have never been alone. Someone is here, and has been here all along. The silence of intimacy is what lovers share when words are no longer needed, when presence itself becomes language. Think of two people deeply in love. At first they talk constantly, getting to know each other, sharing stories, asking questions. But as love deepens, something changes. They can sit together in silence, and it's not awkward. It's communion. Words are no longer needed. Presence itself becomes language. Each knows the other is there, and that is enough. That is the silence of intimacy. That is what God offers in His quiet. That is how God speaks when your words run out, not in thunder, but in nearness. When you have said everything you know to say, when your prayers have exhausted your vocabulary, when your heart has poured out all it can articulate, your words run out. And that is when God speaks, not in thunder, not in dramatic pronouncements, not in overwhelming experiences, not in spectacular signs, but in nearness, in the simple, profound reality of His presence close to yours, in the intimacy of being held without being spoken to, in the communion that exists beyond language. You may not notice it at first, this nearness, this presence, this intimacy in the silence. You may not notice it at first. It's subtle. It's quiet. It doesn't announce itself. The mind resists stillness. It seeks distraction. Your mind is trained to be busy. It has learned to jump from thought, to stay occupied, to avoid the discomfort of simply being. The mind resists stillness. It finds reasons to move, excuses to stop sitting, thoughts that seem urgent enough to pull you out of the silence. It seeks distraction, not maliciously, but instinctively, because stillness feels vulnerable, unknown, unsafe. But slowly, if you keep sitting in that quiet, you begin to hear the pulse beneath all creation. If you persist, if you return to the silence again and again, if you keep sitting even when your mind resists. Slowly, not suddenly, not dramatically, you begin to hear the pulse beneath all creation, like hearing a heartbeat, like becoming aware of a rhythm that was always there but you never noticed. The pulse, the throb of life, the beat of existence, the rhythm of being itself. You start to realize that every living thing is breathing in sync with the Creator. Every leaf, every wave, every heartbeat repeating the same ancient prayer. be still, and know. Everything alive is breathing, every leaf trembling in the breeze, every wave rolling to shore, every heartbeat pumping blood. And they're all in sync, not by accident, not by coincidence, but by design, with the Creator breathing his breath, moving to his rhythm, repeating the same ancient prayer, be still and know. Not be busy and accomplish, not be anxious and control. Be still, stop, rest, cease striving, and know not learn more information, but know him. Encounter him, experience him. That command is not only about calm, it is about revelation. Be still and know that I am God. We often interpret this as a call to calm down, to relax, to reduce our stress, and it is that. But it is not only about calm, it is about revelation, about God revealing himself, about truth being made known, about mysteries being unveiled. The stillness creates the condition where revelation becomes possible. Stillness is not the absence of movement, it is the awareness of God moving in everything. True stillness is not death, not paralysis, not the absence of movement. It is the awareness, the awakening to, the conscious recognition of God moving in everything, in every breath, every heartbeat, every moment. He is moving, working, acting, sustaining. And when you become still, you become aware of it. The whisper that Elijah would later hear on the mountain was already alive in the wind and stone and silence of the beginning. When Elijah stood on the mountain and experienced wind and earthquake and fire, God was not in those dramatic displays. God came in a whisper. But that whisper, that gentle, quiet voice was already alive. From the beginning. In the wind that moved over the waters. In the stone that formed the earth. In the silence that preceded creation. God's whisper has always been there, speaking, revealing, inviting. There, in the unspoken, lies the secret of faith, not in the loud declarations, not in the dramatic experiences, not in the obvious miracles. There, in the unspoken, in the quiet, in the silence that feels like nothing, lies the secret of faith. The mystery that can only be discovered in stillness, the truth that can only be known through waiting. The reality that only reveals itself to those who stop long enough to notice. Not everything holy must be heard to be understood. We think we need words to understand, explanations to comprehend, sermons to grasp truth. But not everything holy must be heard with ears, in language, in articulated form to be understood. Some things are known differently, deeper, more immediately. Some truths can only be known by resting in them. You cannot think your way into some truths. You cannot study your way to some realities. Some truths can only be known by resting in them, by being in them, by letting them hold you until you understand not with your mind but with your whole being. Like learning to float, you can't think your way to it. You have to trust, relax, rest in the water until your body understands what your mind cannot explain. The greatest sermons of God are often preached in silence. The sunrise that speaks of renewal, the night sky that speaks of infinitude, the unbroken moment that tells you that you are seen. God's best messages often come without words. The sunrise painting the sky in colours that declare his creativity, his faithfulness, his gift of new beginnings. That speaks of renewal without saying a word. The night sky vast, deep, filled with countless stars. That speaks of infinitude, of a God bigger than we can imagine, more expansive than we can measure. The unbroken moment when time seems to stop and you're simply held in the present. That tells you that you are seen, known, not forgotten, not overlooked, seen. So tonight, let the noise fade. This is the invitation, the call. The opportunity before you. Tonight, this moment, this sacred now. Let the noise fade. Not force it away, not fight it. Let it fade. Allow it to diminish. Give it permission to recede into the background. Let your thoughts slow, your racing mind, your spinning worries, your endless mental calculations. Let your thoughts slow. Not stop entirely, that's nearly impossible, but slow, like a river calming from rapids to gentle current. Let them move at a different pace, a quieter rhythm, a more sustainable speed. Do not try to fill the silence, let it fill you. This is crucial. Your instinct will be to fill the silence with something: prayers, music, thoughts, plans. Do not try to fill the silence. Resist that urge. Instead, let it fill you. Turn the direction around. Be filled rather than filling. Receive rather than producing. Let the silence pour into you, occupy you, saturate you. Somewhere inside it, the same God who spoke light into darkness is speaking still. Inside the silence, not beyond it, not after it, but within it, the same God. The Eternal One, the Creator, the one who spoke light into darkness at the beginning of time, is speaking still, present tense, right now, in this moment, in your silence. He is speaking. His language has not changed. The way he communicates remains constant. He has not adapted to our preference for noise. He has not modified his methods to match our impatience. His language has not changed. It is what it has always been. It is older than words, deeper than sound. Before human language evolved, before vocal cords formed words, before mouths shaped sentences, his language existed, older than words, more ancient than speech, deeper than sound, beneath the audible, below the surface, in the depths where spirit speaks to spirit. It is silence that heals, silence that holds, silence that reveals. Not noise, not constant input, not endless talking. It is silence, the very thing we've been avoiding, the condition we've been fleeing, that heals the wounds words cannot touch, that holds the pain too deep for expression, that reveals the truths too profound for language. And in that sacred hush, something begins to stir. Not a sound, not a voice, but a knowing. In that sacred hush, the silence you've entered, the stillness you've embraced, the quiet you've allowed, something begins to stir. Not a sound you can hear with ears, not a voice speaking in words, but a knowing, an awareness, a recognition rising from somewhere deeper than thought. The heart feels it before the mind can name it, the presence of the eternal, waiting in the stillness, whispering softly without speaking at all. Your heart knows before your head can explain. The heart feels it, senses it, perceives it, recognizes it, before the mind can name it, before you have language for it, before you can articulate what's happening. The presence of the eternal God himself, timeless, infinite, holy, waiting in the stillness, not absent from it, in it, within it, waiting for you there, whispering softly, communicating, connecting, communing, without speaking at all, without words, without sound, without anything your ears can detect, and yet somehow you hear, you know, you understand. He is here. There was once a man who ran from fear into silence, not from cowardice, though fear drove him, not from weakness, though his strength was spent. He ran because sometimes the only escape from what threatens to destroy you is to run toward what you don't yet understand. From fear, the terror that had suddenly overwhelmed him after victory, the dread that came not from defeat, but from the realization that even triumph changes nothing if hearts remain hard. Into silence, not seeking it intentionally perhaps, but finding it waiting for him at the end of his running. His name was Elijah, and the world around him burned with rage and noise. Elijah, the prophet, the man of God, the one who had spoken boldly before kings and confronted an entire nation's idolatry. And the world around him burned, not literally, though fire had recently fallen from heaven at his word, but burned with rage. The queen's fury, the people's fickleness, the grinding chaos of a nation torn between gods, and noise, the constant clamour of accusation, of threat, of political manoeuvring, of spiritual warfare played out in the visible realm. He had stood on Mount Carmel and called down fire from heaven. He had seen the power of God consume the false altars, yet the very next day he fled into the wilderness, heart heavy, spirit hollow. The context makes his flight even more bewildering. He had stood on Mount Carmel, the scene of his greatest triumph, his most dramatic miracle, and called down fire from heaven, not by his own power, but by calling on God, who answered spectacularly. He had seen the power of God consume the false altars, witnessed undeniable proof that the Lord is God, watched as the people fell on their faces and acknowledged truth. Yet the very next day he fled, not months later, not after the memory had faded. The very next day, when the victory was fresh, when the miracle was still being talked about, when everything should have been different, into the wilderness away from people, away from ministry, away from everything, heart heavy burdened, weighted, pressed down, spirit hollow empty, depleted, void of the strength that had sustained him through confrontation. Triumph had not given him peace. This is one of the most sobering realities in all of Scripture. He had just experienced the most dramatic victory of his ministry, perhaps of his life. Triumph complete, undeniable, overwhelming, had not given him peace. The external victory did not produce internal rest. The miracle did not cure his soul. The vindication did not heal his heart. He had done everything right, and still the world was wrong. He had obeyed God perfectly. He had spoken truth boldly. He had trusted for the impossible and seen it happen. He had done everything right, followed instructions, maintained integrity, acted in faith. And still the world was wrong. Jezebel still threatened. The people still wavered. The spiritual darkness still pressed in. Doing everything right didn't fix everything broken, so he went where only silence could find him. Not where he could find silence. He wasn't seeking it consciously, wasn't pursuing contemplation or spiritual retreat. Where only silence could find him. Into a place so remote, so empty, so devoid of human presence that silence was the only thing that could reach him there. Sometimes we don't choose silence. Sometimes we run until we're so far from everything that silence is all that remains. He walked until the land itself seemed to vanish beneath his feet, a long, hot path through emptiness. The journey was not short, not easy, not comfortable. He walked, not rode, not was carried, but walked on his own feet, step after exhausted step, until the land itself seemed to vanish beneath his feet. The familiar terrain giving way to desert, the landmarks disappearing, everything he knew fading into sameness. A long, hot path grueling, relentless, draining. Through emptiness, not through interesting scenery or varied landscape, but through nothing, through absence, through void. No applause followed him now, no voice called his name. The contrast to Carmel is stark. There had been spectacle, witnesses, acclaim. But no applause followed him now. No crowd cheering his faith. No people celebrating his courage. No voice called his name. No one seeking him out. No one asking for his wisdom or his prayers. The prophet who once stood before kings now collapsed beneath a broom tree, asking to die. from standing before kings to collapsing beneath a tree, from confronting evil to asking for death, from bold declarations to desperate pleas. Beneath a broom tree, not even impressive shade, just a scrubby desert bush, asking to die. Not figuratively, not as exaggeration, literally praying for death as release. "It is enough, Lord," he said. "Take my life. I've had enough. I can't do this anymore. I don't want to keep going. Just let me die." But heaven did not answer in thunder. He might have expected thunder, or at least he might have expected something dramatic, a rebuke for his weakness, a challenge to his faith, a demand that he get up and get back to work. But heaven did not answer in thunder, not with noise, not with drama, not with the spectacular display of power. It answered in rest. The response was rest, not a sermon, not a miracle, not a vision. Rest, the most basic, most necessary, most overlooked need of his body and soul. An angel touched him, not with spectacle, not with prophecy, but with bread and water. The touch was gentle, the provision was simple. Bread and water, the basics of survival, the fundamentals of physical sustenance. Not a feast, not luxury, just what he needed. He did not speak a word, the angel. He did not speak a word, no lecture, no rebuke, no theological discourse, no attempt to fix Elijah's thinking or correct his theology or challenge his perspective. Just quiet presence and practical care. Sometimes love does not explain, it simply sustains. Sometimes the most loving thing is not to talk, but to provide. Not to correct, but to nourish. Not to fix, but to sustain. Elijah ate, drank, and slept again. The simplest activities, the most basic needs met. He ate, received nourishment for his body. Drank, received hydration for his cells. And slept again, received rest for his exhaustion. Then strengthened, he journeyed 40 days into the heart of the wilderness, to Mount Horeb, the mountain of God. Strengthened, not healed completely, not restored fully, but strengthened enough to continue. He journeyed 40 days, the same number of days Israel wandered per year in the wilderness, the same number of days Moses fasted on the mountain, the same number of days Jesus would later fast in the desert, a time of testing, of preparation, of stripping away. Into the heart of the wilderness, deeper still, farther from everything, further into isolation. To Mount Horeb, also called Sinai, the mountain where Moses met God, where the law was given, where God had revealed himself before. There, in a cave carved by ancient wind, he hid, not stood boldly, not proclaimed confidently, he hid. In a cave, a hollow place, a darkness, a womb of stone, carved by ancient wind shaped over millennia by forces patient and persistent. The silence of that place was alive, a kind of waiting that pressed against his heart. Not dead silence, not empty silence, but silence alive with expectation, a kind of waiting pregnant, full, on the verge of something, that pressed against his heart, not comfortable, not peaceful yet, but present, insistent, unavoidable. Outside, creation seemed to hold its breath, the natural world participating in the moment, seeming to hold its breath, pausing, waiting, anticipating. The wind stilled, the birds quieted, everything waiting for what would come next. Then the voice of God came, not in command but in question. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Not "what do you think you're doing?" or "why did you run?" or "don't you know better?" The voice of God came gentle, personal, present, not in command. God didn't issue orders. He didn't make demands, but in question, an invitation to honest conversation. "What are you doing here, Elijah? Tell me. Explain. Share your heart." He answered from weariness, not rebellion. I have been very zealous for the Lord, but I am alone. His answer was honest, raw, from weariness, from the depth of his exhaustion, from the place of his depletion, not rebellion. He wasn't shaking his fist at God. He wasn't refusing to serve. He was just spent. I have been very zealous for the Lord. I've tried. I've given everything. I've been faithful, but I am alone. And that's the core of his pain, not that he failed, but that he succeeded, and it didn't matter. Not that he was unfaithful, but that he was faithful, and still ended up isolated. They have torn down your altars and killed your prophets, and I am the only one left. The nation has abandoned you. The spiritual infrastructure is destroyed. The other prophets are dead, and I am the only one left, the last faithful voice, the only one standing completely alone. His words trembled like a confession, not steady and sure, but trembling, like a confession vulnerable, exposed, the truth he'd been carrying alone finally spoken aloud. Loneliness spoke through faith. Even deep faith cannot always silence the pain of isolation. Then God said, "Go out and stand on the mountain before me. Not stay in the cave, not hide yourself. Go out, leave the darkness, leave the hiding place, leave the isolation, and stand on the mountain exposed, visible, in the open, before me in my presence, where you can see and be seen, where encounter can happen." Elijah obeyed, and the silence broke. He went out. He stood. He positioned himself for whatever God would do, and the silence broke, shattered, interrupted, replaced by sound and fury. First came a mighty wind that tore the rocks apart, power that could have crushed the mountain itself. The first manifestation was wind, not a gentle breeze but a mighty wind, so strong it tore the rocks apart, split stone, moved boulders, demonstrated raw physical force. Power that could have crushed the mountain itself, overwhelming, terrifying, impressive. But the Lord was not in the wind. This is the first surprise. With all that power, with all that drama, with all that spectacular force, the Lord was not in the wind. His presence was not there, not in the impressive display, not in the overwhelming force. Then came an earthquake, the ground splitting, the world shaking with fury. The second manifestation, an earthquake, the earth itself convulsing, breaking, heaving, the ground splitting cracks opening, bedrock fracturing, the world shaking with fury, violent, chaotic, frightening. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. Again the surprise. Surely here, surely in this shaking of foundations, this demonstration of power over creation itself. But no, the Lord was not in the earthquake. His presence was not there. Then fire swept across the cliffs, fierce and consuming, the same flame that once fell from heaven, yet still the Lord was not in the fire. The third manifestation. Fire, the element Elijah knew well, had called down, had seen consume sacrifice and altar and stone. Swept across the cliffs moving, living, destroying everything in its path. Fierce and consuming, overwhelming, total, unstoppable. The same flame that once fell from heaven, the same kind of fire that had vindicated him on Carmel. Yet still the Lord was not in the fire. Even this, even the fire he associated with God's power and presence, God was not there. And after the fire came silence. The pause is everything. After all that noise, after all that power, after all that drama, silence. Not another manifestation, not another display. Just silence. The absence of sound following the overwhelming presence of sound. It was not empty, it was full. This is the key distinction. The silence was not void, not barren, not mere absence. It was full, pregnant with presence, heavy with meaning, saturated with God. A stillness so deep it trembled with presence. Stillness, no movement, no sound, no external activity. So deep, profound, complete, all-encompassing. It trembled with presence, not empty but vibrating with someone's nearness. It did not shout or dazzle. No drama, no spectacle, no attempt to impress. It simply was, existing, present, real, undeniable in its quiet reality. Elijah covered his face with his cloak, for he knew. His response was immediate and instinctive. He covered his face, the gesture of reverence, of recognizing holiness, of acknowledging that he stood before the divine, with his cloak, whatever garment he had, pulling it over his face. For he knew, not guessed, not wondered, knew, recognized, understood instantly. God was here. He stepped out into that holy quiet, and in that moment he heard the sound that was not sound, the whisper that carried more power than the storm. He stepped out, left the cave again, or perhaps was already standing outside, into that holy quiet. Not just quiet, holy quiet, sacred silence, and in that moment, the precise instant of encounter, he heard, not with ears alone but with his whole being, the sound that was not sound paradoxical, beyond normal categories of auditory experience. The whisper. Some translations say still small voice, or gentle whisper, or sound of sheer silence, that carried more power than the storm, more real authority, more transforming force, more divine presence than all the wind and earthquake and fire combined. That was how God revealed himself, not through force, but through gentleness. This is the lesson, the revelation, the truth Elijah needed. God revealed himself, made himself known, showed his nature, demonstrated his character, not through force, despite being able to command wind and earthquake and fire, despite having all power at his disposal, but through gentleness, through quiet, through the whisper that requires you to lean in close to hear, not through spectacle, but through nearness, not by impressing from a distance, not by overwhelming with displays of power that keep you at arm's length, but through nearness, through intimacy, through closeness, through the kind of communication that only happens when two beings are very close together. The same one who could shake the heavens chose instead to speak in a whisper, because truth that changes the heart does not need to shout. He could have shouted, he could have thundered, he could have overwhelmed, but he chose instead to speak in a whisper. Why? Because truth that changes the heart not just informs the mind, not just impresses the senses, but changes the heart does not need to shout. It works quietly, deeply, from the inside out. In that whisper, Elijah found what he had forgotten. He was not alone. The content of the whisper began to penetrate, not immediately, not all at once. But as Elijah listened, as God spoke, he found what he had forgotten, the truth he had lost sight of in his isolation. He was not alone. There were others, 7,000 who had not bowed to Baal, 7,000 hearts still faithful in the silence. God had preserved a remnant, 7,000 a significant number, a community, a people, who had not bowed to Baal, who had remained faithful despite pressure, despite danger, despite being surrounded by idolatry. 7,000 hearts still faithful in the silence, not public about it, not making declarations on mountaintops, but faithful nonetheless, quietly, persistently, in the hidden places. The world had not ended. It had merely gone quiet enough for grace to take root. Elijah's perspective was shifting. The world had not ended. His fears were not reality. Everything was not lost. It had merely gone quiet. The noise had subsided. The clamour had ceased. Enough for grace to take root. for new life to begin germinating, for hope to find soil, for God's purposes to continue working even when they couldn't be seen or heard. He left the mountain different than he arrived. The encounter changed him, not magically, not instantly making everything easy, but he left different, transformed by the whisper, altered by the presence, reoriented by the truth. The fear was still there, the struggle unchanged, but now he carried a peace that the noise could not touch. The external circumstances hadn't necessarily changed. The fear Jezebel's threat, the danger, the opposition was still there, real, present. The struggle, the spiritual battle, the challenge of ministry, the difficulty of standing for truth unchanged. The same obstacles remained. But now he carried something new, a peace in a settledness, divine calm, unshakable assurance, that the noise could not touch, that circumstances could not destroy, that opposition could not steal. He had learned that God's greatest miracles are not the ones that break nature, but the ones that mend the soul. The fire from heaven was impressive. The victory on Carmel was dramatic. But God's greatest miracles, the ones that matter most, the ones that last longest, the ones that change everything are not the ones that break nature, not the spectacular displays that violate physical laws, but the ones that mend the soul, that heal the inner brokenness, that restore the spirit, that bring peace where chaos reigned. Sometimes God hides in the quiet because he wants to be found not in the wind or the fire, but in the space where only love can speak. Sometimes God seems absent not because he is far, but because he is near in a way we don't recognize. God hides in the quiet, not playing games, not being difficult, but positioning himself where only those who truly seek will find. Because he wants to be found, he desires the encounter, longs for the connection, not in the wind or the fire, not in the impressive, the dramatic, the overwhelming, but in the space where only love can speak, in the intimate place, in the whisper, in the closeness that requires vulnerability. The whisper is his way of drawing us close enough to hear his heartbeat. Why does God whisper? Not to make things difficult, not to test our hearing, but to draw us close. The whisper is his way, his method, his strategy, his loving approach, of drawing us close enough nearer than we'd come if he shouted, more intimate than we'd be if he thundered. To hear his heartbeat, not just his words, not just his commands, but his heartbeat, the rhythm of his love, the pulse of his being, the core of who he is. And long after Elijah left the mountain, the whisper remained, echoing through centuries, waiting for those who would dare to listen beyond the thunder. The sound of dripping water echoed softly in the cave, each drop falling like a heartbeat. In the darkness, sound becomes everything. Each sense heightens when sight is limited. The sound of dripping water steady, rhythmic, eternal. Water finding its way through stone, through centuries of rock, drop by patient drop. Echoed softly, not harshly, not violently, but with the gentle persistence of something that cannot be stopped. In the cave enclosed, hidden, sheltered from the world above, a womb of stone, a sanctuary of shadow, each drop falling like a heartbeat, the rhythm of life itself, the pulse that marks time when time seems to have stopped. Each drop singular, distinct, counted, like a heartbeat, organic, living, the sound of something continuing when everything else has paused. In that cave, the water speaks what words cannot. It says, "You are alive. Time is passing. God is present even here." The man who would be king sat in the shadows, his back against stone, his soul heavy with both calling and confusion. The man who would be king, not yet a king, not currently powerful, not presently ruling, but would be destined, promised, anointed for something not yet manifested, sat in the shadows, not standing in glory, not walking in light, but sitting, waiting, hidden, in the shadows where nothing is clear, where vision is obscured, where the future cannot be seen, his back against stone, the hardness of reality, the unyielding nature of his circumstances, stone that will not move, will not soften, will not yield to wishes or prayers for comfort, his soul heavy, not light, not free, not soaring, heavy, burdened, weighted down, with both calling and confusion, the two together, inseparable. He knows he is called Al. Samuel's oil still glistens in his memory. The prophet's words still echo in his heart. But confusion accompanies the calling. How can both be true? How can he be chosen and yet be here? How can he be anointed and yet be hunted? David had been anointed by Samuel long ago, but the throne he was promised now seemed like a dream fading at dawn. The anointing was real. David had been there. He had felt the oil run down his face, seen the prophet's eyes, heard the declaration over his life. Samuel's hand had trembled with the weight of what God was doing. Long ago, not yesterday, not recently, but long ago. Time enough to doubt. Time enough to wonder if it really happened the way he remembers. But the throne he was promised, not suggested, not hinted at, promised definitively, clearly, by God through his prophet, now seemed like a dream fading at dawn. You know that feeling when you wake and try to hold on to a dream, but it slips away even as you grasp for it. The throne seemed that unreal, that distant, that impossible. Fading, not gone yet, but going, losing substance, losing reality, losing believability. At dawn in the early light, when dreams must give way to the harsh reality of day. Between the promise and the fulfillment lay wilderness, long nights, narrow escapes, and silence that stretched like eternity. This is the geography of faith. Between the promise, what God said, what was declared, what was anointed, and the fulfillment, the actual realization, the manifestation, the seeing of what was spoken, lay wilderness, not a straight path, not a clear road, not a direct route, wilderness unmapped, dangerous, disorienting, a place where you can easily lose your way. Long nights, not just one difficult evening, not just a brief season of darkness. Long nights plural, multiple, endless seeming, when sleep won't come, when fear speaks loudest, when the darkness feels permanent, narrow escapes, so many times almost caught, so many moments when death seemed certain, so many close calls that left him shaking, breathless, wondering how much longer his luck would hold, and silence that stretched like eternity. God's voice, once so clear through Samuel, now seemingly absent. The silence, not brief, not temporary, that stretched, extended, elongated, pulled thin, like eternity feeling endless, feeling permanent, feeling as though it might never break. Outside, the desert of En-Gedi shimmered under the sun. The air was dry, the cliffs hollowed by time. It was a land of refuge and exile both. Outside the cave beyond the immediate shelter, beyond the stone walls. The desert of En-Gedi. A specific place, a real location. An actual geography where this spiritual formation happened. Shimmered under the sun, heat rising, light bending, reality distorting in the waves of warmth. Everything appears fluid, unstable, shifting. The air was dry. No moisture, no relief. Every breath drawing in heat and dust. The cliffs hollowed by time. Not by sudden catastrophe, not by dramatic events, but by time. Wind and water and centuries wearing away the stone, creating caves, forming hiding places. Hollowed, emptied out, carved away, made into vessels that could hold a man and his questions. It was a land of refuge and exile both, paradox, contradiction, two truths existing simultaneously, refuge, safety, shelter, protection from those who hunted him, and exile, banishment, separation, distance from where he was meant to be, both at once, saved and suffering, protected and punished, safe and separated. In that wilderness, David learned to live between destiny and delay. He learned that being chosen did not mean being comfortable. In that wilderness, not in the palace, not in comfort, not in ideal circumstances. There, in the harsh and unforgiving landscape. David learned, not knew already, not understood from the beginning, learned through experience, through pain, through the slow accumulation of hard-won wisdom. To live between destiny and delay, to inhabit the space between promise and fulfillment, to exist in the tension of already anointed but not yet reigning. He learned that being chosen did not mean being comfortable. This is crucial. We think God's favour equals ease. We assume calling equals comfort. We believe anointing equals immediate advancement. But David learned otherwise. Being chosen, selected, anointed, marked out for greatness, did not mean being comfortable, did not guarantee ease, did not promise comfort or convenience or pleasant circumstances. Saul's armies hunted him, the same Saul whose court once celebrated his victories. The same hand that once lifted him up now sought to destroy him. Saul's armies, not just Saul himself, but armies organized, equipped, numerous, hunted him, pursued with intention, tracked with determination, sought with violence. The same Saul. This matters. Not a stranger, not an enemy from birth. The same Saul whose court once celebrated his victories. The king who had welcomed him. The ruler who had honored him. The man who had loved him like a son. The same hand that once lifted him up. Saul had elevated David, had given him position, honor, recognition, had raised him from shepherd boy to warrior, from obscurity to fame, now sought to destroy him. The reversal is complete. The love has turned to hatred. The honor has become murder. The same hand that blessed now curses. The same voice that praised now condemns. The young warrior who had slain a giant now fled from his king, hiding among rocks, relying on the kindness of strangers, surrounded by men as weary and restless as he was. The young warrior who had slain a giant. That victory defined him. Everyone knew the story. David and Goliath. The impossible victory. The faith that conquered. Now fled from his king. From victor to fugitive. From champion to refugee. From celebrated to hunted. Hiding among rocks reduced to caves and crevices, to the places where only the desperate go. Relying on the kindness of strangers. No longer in the palace with provision guaranteed. No longer surrounded by servants meeting his needs. Dependent on those who owed him nothing, hoping for mercy from those who had their own problems. Surrounded by men as weary and restless as he was. His followers were not elite soldiers. They were the desperate, the discarded, the indebted. Men running from their own troubles. Men as tired and uncertain as David himself. There were nights when he must have wondered if the prophet's oil had been a mistake. How could he be chosen when he was reduced to running, starving, hiding? Where was God's promise when caves were his palaces and silence his only companion? There were nights, not all nights perhaps, but some, enough, dark nights of the soul when doubt crept in, when he must have wondered. We can imagine it because we've been there. If the prophet's oil had been a mistake. Did Samuel hear God correctly? Did the anointing really happen? Was it all a misunderstanding, a misinterpretation, a tragic error? How could he be chosen when he was reduced to running, starving, hiding. The evidence seemed to contradict the promise. Chosen people don't run. Chosen people don't starve. Chosen people don't hide in caves. Also, we think, where was God's promise when caves were his palaces and silence his only companion? The contrast is devastating. Caves instead of palaces. Silence instead of the voice of God. Isolation instead of community. And yet it was there, in that stillness, in that waiting, that David's heart was shaped. And yet, these two words change everything. Despite appearances, despite circumstances, despite the suffering, and yet there was something else happening, something unseen, something profound. It was there in the very place that seemed like abandonment, in that stillness, the quiet that felt like absence, in that waiting, the delay that felt like denial, that David's heart was shaped, not broken, not destroyed, not ruined, shaped, formed intentionally, moulded purposefully, crafted carefully, like clay on a potter's wheel, like metal in fire, like stone under a sculptor's chisel. His heart, the core of who he was, the centre of his being, the essence of his character, was shaped. In the wilderness, in the silence, in the waiting. The same God who gave him victory in battle was now giving him mastery over his own soul. Power would one day be his, but humility had to come first. The same God, consistent, unchanging, the one who empowered him to face Goliath, who gave him victory in battle, obvious, visible, celebrated triumph, was now giving him mastery over his own soul. A different kind of victory, harder, more important, less visible. Mastery over his own soul, control over his reactions, governance of his emotions, authority over his impulses. Power would one day be his. The promise remained true. The throne was still his destiny. But humility had to come first. Before power, humility. Before authority, surrender. Before ruling others, ruling himself. The order matters. God was not denying the promise. He was preparing David to handle it. One night, deep in the cavern, he heard footsteps. Flickers of torchlight danced on the stone. It was Saul himself, unguarded, entering the same cave to rest. One night, a specific moment, a particular time. Not any night, but the night when everything would change. Deep in the cavern, in the furthest reaches, in the darkest corners, in the hidden places. He heard footsteps, not imagined them, not feared them, heard them, real, approaching, dangerous. Flickers of torchlight danced on the stone, light breaking into the darkness, shadows moving, shapes becoming visible, danced, moved, flickered, created patterns on the cave walls. It was Saul himself. Not soldiers, not servants, the king, the enemy, the one who had hunted him for so long. Unguarded, vulnerable, exposed, without protection, entering the same cave, the hunted and the hunter in the same space, neither knowing the other was there. To rest, not to search, not to attack, just to rest. The soldiers whispered, this was David's chance. One strike and the chase would end. The crown would finally be his. The soldiers whispered. His men saw the opportunity immediately, recognized the moment, understood the implications. This was David's chance. Divine providence, perfect timing. The enemy delivered into his hand. One strike swift, sudden, final, and the chase would end. No more running, no more hiding, no more fear. The crown would finally be his. Everything promised, everything hoped for, everything delayed, all his in one moment of violence. But David's hand trembled. He crept forward, cut a corner of Saul's robe, and stepped back into the dark. Even that small act pierced his conscience. But David's hand trembled, not with fear, not with weakness, with the weight of the decision, with the knowledge that how you gain power matters as much as gaining it. He crept forward, silently, carefully, intentionally, cut a corner of Saul's robe, not Saul himself, just the robe, evidence that he could have killed but chose not to, and stepped back into the dark. Restraint, self-control, obedience. Even that small act pierced his conscience. Just cutting the robe felt wrong. That's how sensitive his heart had become. That's how refined his spirit was after all those nights in the wilderness. He had learned reverence. He had internalized honor. He had become someone who could hold power and not abuse it. The Lord forbid that I should stretch out my hand against his anointed. This is the statement that defines the moment. The Lord forbid. Not, I don't want to, or it wouldn't be right. The Lord forbid. God's will taking precedence over his own survival. That I should stretch out my hand, take action, exercise power, do violence against his anointed. Saul was still God's anointed, regardless of his behavior, regardless of his pursuit, regardless of his attempts to kill David. God had anointed him, and that status was not David's to revoke. He understood then that the promise of God cannot be taken by force. It must unfold in time. Even in danger, even in silence, God's will remains perfect. He understood then, not before, not in theory, but in that moment, in that cave, with the knife in his hand and the opportunity before him, he understood that the promise of God cannot be taken by force. You cannot seize what God has ordained. You cannot grab what God intends to give. It must unfold in time. God's timing, God's way, God's method. Even in danger, when threatened, when hunted, when it seems justified to act. Even in silence, when God seems absent, when direction seems unclear, when confirmation seems withheld. God's will remains perfect. Not almost perfect, not mostly perfect. Perfect, complete, right, true, regardless of how it feels. The same stillness that had frightened him now became holy. It was no longer emptiness, it was obedience, the same stillness. The silence that had tormented him during the long wilderness years, that had frightened him, made him doubt, made him question, made him wonder if God had forgotten, now became holy, set apart, sacred, purposeful. It was no longer emptiness, not absence, not abandonment, not neglect. It was obedience, the sound of submission, the space where God's will is chosen over human instinct. When Saul left the cave, David followed him into the light and cried out, holding up the torn cloth, "See, my father, the Lord delivered you into my hand today, but I would not harm you." When Saul left the cave, unaware of what had just happened, unaware of the mercy he'd been shown, David followed him into the light, out of the darkness, out of hiding, into vulnerability, and cried out, raised his voice, made himself known, took the risk of exposing himself, holding up the torn cloth, physical evidence, proof of what could have been. See, my father, still calling him father, still honouring the relationship, still respecting the position. The Lord delivered you into my hand today, acknowledging God's sovereignty, recognizing the opportunity as divine, but I would not harm you, the choice, the restraint, the mercy. His voice echoed through the ravine, trembling with mercy. Saul turned, and for a moment his heart broke. "You are more righteous than I," he said, "for you have repaid me with good, though I sought your life." His voice echoed through the ravine, the stone walls carrying his words, trembling with mercy, not anger, not accusation, not triumph, mercy. The emotion that marks those who have been shaped by God. Saul turned, stopped, looked back, and for a moment his heart broke. The hardness cracked, the hatred paused, the madness cleared. "You are more righteous than I," he said. Confession, admission, recognition of the truth he'd been denying. "For you have repaid me with good, though I sought your life." The contrast exposed. David's response to evil was good. Saul's response to good was evil. And in that moment Saul saw it clearly. Then the wind moved through the desert again, and the silence returned. But it was not the same silence. Then the wind moved through the desert again. Life continuing. Nature indifferent to human drama. The ancient rhythms resuming, and the silence returned. The noise of the encounter faded. The echoes died away. The stillness came back. But it was not the same silence. Something had changed. Something had been transformed. Years passed before David would wear the crown, but the true kingship had already begun in those hidden years, in restraint, in humility, in waiting upon the quiet will of God. Years passed, more waiting, more wilderness, more delay, before David would wear the crown, the physical symbol, the political reality, the visible power. But the true kingship had already begun. The real authority, the genuine power, the actual fitness to rule. In those hidden years, unseen, unrecognized, uncelebrated. In restraint, choosing not to act when he could have. In humility, acknowledging God's authority over his own desires. In waiting upon the quiet will of God, listening for direction that came slowly, trusting purposes that unfolded gradually. The caves became his classrooms, the wilderness his sanctuary. He learned that greatness is not built on conquest but on communion, not on noise but on stillness. The caves, those dark, uncomfortable, desperate places, became his classrooms, where he learned the most important lessons, where character was forged, where wisdom was gained. The wilderness, the harsh, unforgiving landscape of deprivation and danger, his sanctuary, his holy place, his cathedral, where he met God most deeply. He learned that greatness is not built on conquest, not on military victories alone, not on defeating enemies, not on accumulating power, but on communion, on relationship with God, on intimacy with the divine, on knowing and being known, not on noise, not on spectacular displays, not on public acclaim, not on impressive achievements, but on stillness, on the quiet work that no one sees, on the hidden formation that happens when the world isn't watching, and in the depths of that quiet, songs were born. Psalms whispered to the dark, words that would outlast kingdoms, and in the depths of that quiet, in the deepest stillness, in the most profound silence, songs were born, not composed, not constructed, born emerging from something deep within, coming to life, crying out to exist. Psalms, poetry, prayer, praise, lament, truth set to rhythm, whispered to the dark, not shouted, not proclaimed, whispered intimate, personal, barely audible. To the dark, into the void, into the silence, into the night. Words that would outlast kingdoms. David's kingdom would rise and fall. Other kingdoms would come and go. Empires would ascend and decline. But these words born in caves, whispered in wilderness, forged in suffering, would outlast them all. Would speak to hearts millennia later. Would give voice to souls in every generation. In the shadow of your wings I will take refuge until the disaster has passed. Be still before the Lord and wait patiently for him. You are my rock, my fortress, my deliverer. Specific words, particular phrases, real psalms born in real caves. In the shadow of your wings I will take refuge until the disaster has passed. Trust in the midst of threat. Safety in the presence of God. Hope that disaster is temporary. Be still before the Lord and wait patiently for him. The lesson learned through painful experience, the wisdom gained through long wilderness nights. You are my rock, my fortress, my deliverer. Declaration of who God is, testimony to what God does. Long before he ruled Jerusalem, David ruled his own heart. And that was the greater victory. For what is a king who cannot be still before his God? Long before he ruled Jerusalem, before the throne, before the palace, before the crown, before the political power, David ruled his own heart, governed his emotions, controlled his impulses, mastered his desires, and that was the greater victory. Not the military conquests, not the political achievements, not the expansion of territory, but the conquest of self. For what is a king who cannot be still before his God? The question hangs in the air, rhetorical but profound. What good is external authority without internal submission? What value is ruling others if you cannot rule yourself? What worth is political power if you have no spiritual depth? The silence that once felt like exile became the sound of formation. The caves did not hide him from destiny, they prepared him for it. The silence that once felt like exile, punishment, abandonment, separation from where he should be, became the sound of formation, the noise of God working, the music of transformation, the soundtrack of becoming. The caves, those desperate hiding places, did not hide him from destiny, did not delay his calling, did not derail God's purposes. They prepared him for it, shaped him, formed him, made him ready. The desert had no music, no movement, only wind. There was nothing here to entertain the senses, nothing to distract the soul. The desert had no music, no orchestras, no songs, no harmonies crafted by human hands, no movement, no bustling crowds, no marching armies, no commerce or construction. Only wind. The one sound that belonged there, the one motion that was native to that place. Wind that spoke without words, that moved without destination, that simply was. Sand shifted like time, sculpting emptiness into beauty. Watch the sand long enough and you see it move, grain by grain, dune by dune, always shifting, like time invisible in each moment but undeniable over the course of days. Sculpting emptiness, taking what appears to be nothing and shaping it into beauty. The curves of dunes, the patterns left by wind, the textures that catch light at sunrise and sunset. Emptiness became something to behold. It was there, in the vast quiet between heaven and earth, that a man clothed in camel's hair began to speak, not because the silence had ended, but because it had finally found a voice. In that place of emptiness and beauty, in that space where earth meets sky with nothing in between, a man appeared, clothed in camel's hair rough, simple, uncomfortable by the world's standards, began to speak. But understand this, not because the silence had ended, the silence hadn't been broken or interrupted or overcome, but because it had finally found a voice. The silence itself had been waiting, had been preparing, had been gestating something, and now it spoke through this man. John was his name, the child of miracle and waiting, a simple name for an extraordinary calling. John, which means God is gracious. The child of miracle, born to parents too old to conceive, born when hope had died, born as proof that God's timing is not our timing, and waiting. His parents had waited decades, generations had waited centuries. He himself would wait in the wilderness until the appointed time. His very existence was woven from miracle and waiting. He had grown in the solitude of the wild, a son of promise born to parents who had stopped believing in new beginnings. He didn't grow up in the temple, though his father was a priest. He didn't mature in the city, though his calling would eventually draw crowds. He had grown in the solitude of the wild, away from civilization, away from expectations, away from the noise that would have drowned out the voice he needed to hear. A son of promise, the angel Gabriel himself had announced his coming. Born to parents who had stopped believing in new beginnings. Elizabeth and Zechariah had given up hope of children. They had resigned themselves to barrenness. They had stopped believing. And then, impossibly, unbelievably, came John. His life was shaped by silence before he ever learned to speak. Think about that. His father's tongue had been stilled for doubting, struck mute by the angel for questioning the promise. For 9 months of Elizabeth's pregnancy, his father could not speak, his own tongue prepared for proclaiming. While his father was silent, John was being formed in a womb held by an old woman, formed in a home where speech was impossible, formed in mystery and silence. From the beginning, his story was about the voice that emerges from silence. Not the voice that drowns it out, not the voice that fights against it, but the voice that emerges from it, that grows out of it, that is born from its depths. He lived on locusts and honey, drank from streams that vanished by morning, prayed to the God who hides himself in stillness. His diet was minimal, strange, sufficient. Locusts and honey, what the desert provided, nothing cultivated, nothing civilized, nothing dependent on human systems. Drank from streams that vanished by morning, ephemeral water sources, here today and gone tomorrow, teaching dependence, teaching trust. Prayed to the God who hides himself in stillness, the God who doesn't perform on demand, the God who must be sought, the God who reveals himself not in spectacular displays, but in the quiet depths where only the persistent find him. He knew that noise could not birth truth, that prophets are not made in crowds, but in isolation. This was his fundamental understanding, his core conviction. Noise could not birth truth. Crowds could not produce prophets. The clamour of cities, the debates of scholars, the political manoeuvring of the powerful none of it could create what he had become. Prophets are not made in crowds, they are made in isolation, in the lonely places, in the silent spaces, in the wilderness where there is nothing to rely on but God himself. When the world grew restless under Roman rule, John waited. The occupation was oppressive. The taxes were crushing. The injustice was visible everywhere. The world grew restless, anger building, frustration mounting, the pressure of subjugation creating a powder keg. And John waited. Not because he didn't care, not because he was oblivious, but because waiting was part of his calling. When others sought thrones or movements, he sought wilderness. Revolutionaries plotted, zealots recruited, political factions formed. Others sought thrones, power, position, the ability to change things by force, or movements, popular uprisings, organized resistance, human strategies for human problems. He sought wilderness, the opposite of power, the antithesis of control, the place where all human strength is stripped away and only God remains. When others demanded answers, he listened for whispers. Everyone wanted to know, when will the Messiah come? How will we know him? What should we do? Others demanded answers, insisted on clarity, required certainty, needed plans. He listened for whispers, for the still small voice, for the word that comes not in earthquake or fire, but in gentle breath, for the truth that reveals itself only to those who stop shouting long enough to hear. And then when the time was right, when the silence had ripened into fullness, he spoke. Not prematurely, not too late. When the time was right, God's appointed moment, the fullness of time, the intersection of divine purpose and human readiness. When the silence had ripened into fullness, Silence is not static, it grows, it develops, it matures. Like fruit on a tree, it ripens. And when it reaches fullness, when it has become what it was meant to become, then the voice comes. He spoke. His voice broke through the dry air like a storm, not to entertain, not to flatter, but to awaken. The sound of him was shocking. His voice broke through the dry air, the still, parched atmosphere of the desert like a storm. Sudden, powerful, impossible to ignore, not to entertain. He wasn't performing. He wasn't seeking applause, not to flatter. He wasn't telling people what they wanted to hear, but to awaken, to rouse from sleep, to shake from complacency, to disturb comfortable delusions and speak truth that cuts through fog. Repent, he said, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. The message was stark, uncompromising, urgent. Repent, turn around, change direction, abandon your current path. For the kingdom of heaven is at hand, not coming someday far in the future. At hand near, close, within reach, right here, right now. The moment has arrived. His words did not echo against stone, they echoed in hearts. He wasn't speaking in a canyon where sound bounces back. He wasn't in a temple with acoustic architecture. His words did not echo against stone. They didn't need to. They echoed in hearts. They reverberated in souls. They struck something deep and true in everyone who heard them, something that recognized truth even when truth was uncomfortable. People came from every corner, leaving cities behind to hear him. The response was extraordinary. People came, not stayed in their comfortable homes, not sent representatives, but came themselves. From every corner from Jerusalem, from Judea, from beyond the Jordan. Leaving cities behind, abandoning their normal lives, walking away from routine, making the journey to the wilderness, to hear him, not to see miracles, not to receive blessings, just to hear him speak truth. Soldiers, scholars, tax collectors, peasants, all drawn by something they could not name. Every class, every type. Soldiers trained in violence, hardened by occupation. Scholars educated, intellectual, versed in scripture. Tax collectors, wealthy from collaboration with Rome, despised by their own people. Peasants poor, powerless, barely surviving, all drawn by something they could not name, not a theological argument, not a political platform, something deeper, something unnamed, something their souls recognized even if their minds couldn't articulate it. They came not because he promised comfort, but because he carried truth. He didn't offer easy answers. He didn't promise prosperity or victory or relief from suffering. They came not because he promised comfort. They came because he carried truth. Real, undeniable, transformative truth, the kind that costs something to hear and costs more to embrace. But truth nonetheless. In his eyes burned the same fire that once burned in Elijah's. There was something ancient in him, something that connected him to the great prophets of old. In his eyes burned the same fire, the holy passion, the divine urgency, the uncompromising commitment to God's word, that once burned in Elijah's. The prophet who confronted kings, who called down fire from heaven, who stood alone against hundreds of false prophets, that same spirit lived in John. He called out corruption, he stripped away pride, he told the powerful they were dust, and the humble they were seen. His message was not selective. He called out corruption, named it, exposed it, refused to ignore it for the sake of politeness or safety. He stripped away pride, the pretense, the self-righteousness, the religious facade that many wore. He told the powerful they were dust. Their positions meant nothing before God. Their authority was temporary. Their influence was illusion. And the humble they were seen, noticed, known. valued by the God who lifts up the lowly. His message was simple, yet it shook the earth. Prepare the way. Not complex theology, not elaborate rituals. Simple. 3 words. Prepare the way. Make ready. Clear the path. Remove the obstacles. Get your heart ready for what is coming. Yet it shook the earth, because simplicity doesn't mean easy, because preparing the way meant repentance, meant change, meant surrender. And that shook everything. But even prophets are not immune to loneliness. For all the crowds that came to hear him, for all the impact of his words, there remained an essential solitude. Even prophets are not immune to loneliness. They feel it. They know it. The loneliness of carrying a message others don't fully understand. The loneliness of being set apart. The loneliness of seeing what others cannot yet see. When the crowds left, the desert returned to stillness, and he remained, a man between eras, standing at the threshold of fulfillment. After the baptisms, after the teaching, after the confrontations with religious leaders. When the crowds left, went back to their cities, their homes, their lives. The desert returned to stillness. The wind resumed its ancient song, and he remained, alone again. A man between eras, the old covenant ending, the new covenant beginning. Standing at the threshold of fulfillment, 1 foot in the age of promise, 1 foot in the age of reality. Waiting, watching, preparing. He knew he was not the light. He was the voice before dawn. This knowledge shaped everything. He knew he was not the light. He was not the Messiah. He was not the fulfillment. He was the voice before dawn. The announcement that daybreak is coming. The herald who says, "Look, the sun is about to rise." Essential, important, but not the sun itself. He baptized with water, but he longed to see the one who would baptize with spirit and fire. His baptism was real. It meant something. Water washing away the old, symbolizing death to sin and new life. But he baptized with water, the element of cleansing, but still external, still symbolic. He longed to see the one who would baptize with spirit and fire, the one who would not just symbolize transformation but accomplish it, the one whose baptism would be internal, powerful, consuming. Spirit, the very breath of God entering hearts, and fire purifying, refining, burning away everything that cannot survive his holiness. Then one day he looked up, and there he was. The day he had been waiting for, the moment his whole life had been pointing toward. One day, ordinary in most ways, extraordinary in one. He looked up, from the water, from the crowd, from his work, and there he was, not announced with trumpets, not preceded by signs, just there, walking toward the river, walking toward John, walking toward the moment when heaven and earth would meet. The silence of centuries broke when John saw Jesus approaching the river. 400 years since the last prophet had spoken. 400 years of silence from heaven. 400 years of waiting for the Messiah. The silence of centuries long, heavy, almost unbearable, broke, not gradually, not slowly, but in one moment. When John saw Jesus approaching the river, the heavens seemed to hold their breath. Everything paused. Everything waited. The heavens, all the celestial realm, all the angelic hosts, all the cosmic powers seemed to hold their breath. That moment between inhale and exhale, that suspension of time, that pregnant pause before the most important event in human history. John's own voice softened, the voice that had roared like thunder, the voice that had called the powerful to repent, the voice that had shaken the desert and drawn crowds. John's own voice softened, not silenced, not gone, but changed, gentle, reverent, filled with wonder. Behold the Lamb of God, who takes away the sin of the world. Not behold the King, or behold the Conqueror. Behold the Lamb of God, the sacrifice, the offering, the one who would die, who takes away the sin of the world. Not just Israel's sin, not just some sin, the sin of the world, all of it. Every particle, every act, every thought, every failure of humanity from the beginning to the end. He had waited his whole life for that moment, the moment when his purpose and God's presence finally met. Everything had been leading here, every day in the wilderness, every locust eaten, every sermon preached, every person baptized. His whole life from the miraculous birth to this river had been preparation for that moment, when his purpose to prepare the way, to point to the Messiah, and God's presence embodied in Jesus, walking in flesh, finally met. The river glistened like mercy itself as Jesus stepped into the water, the ordinary river, the muddy Jordan. The water that had flowed for millennia suddenly became extraordinary, glistened like mercy itself, reflecting light like grace, shimmering with significance. As Jesus stepped into the water, God entering the element that cleanses, the sinless one identifying with sinners, the infinite becoming immersed. John's hands trembled as he lowered him beneath the surface, the water rippling with eternity. Can you imagine? John's hands, rough from the wilderness, strong from simplicity, trembled. As he lowered him, the creator of water being baptized in it, beneath the surface, under the water, symbolically dying. The water rippling with eternity, each circle spreading outward not just physically, but spiritually. Ripples that would reach the ends of the earth and the end of time. And when he rose, the sky opened, and the Spirit descended like a dove. When he rose, coming up out of the water, resurrection foreshadowed, new creation beginning, the sky opened, heaven rent apart, the barrier between heaven and earth torn open, and the Spirit descended, visibly, tangibly, like a dove gentle, pure, settling on him with unmistakable clarity. A voice came from heaven, clear, calm, final. This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Not thunder this time, not earthquake. A voice the Father himself speaking, from heaven, audible. Witnesses heard it, clear, unmistakable, understandable, calm, not frantic, not urgent, but settled. Final, definitive, establishing, declaring. This is my beloved Son, identity confirmed, relationship declared, in whom I am well pleased, approval given, delight expressed, the Father's pleasure in the Son pronounced over the water. The silence that had lingered since the prophets ended was over. 400 years of waiting, over. The silence, that long, heavy quiet, that had lingered, remained, persisted, stretched on year after year, since the prophets ended, since Malachi's final words, was over. God was speaking again, not just through a prophet now, but in flesh, in his Son. Yet even now John felt its beauty, for he knew his own voice must fade for the true word to be heard. The silence was ending, but John understood something profound. Yet even now, in this moment of culmination, in this triumph of his ministry, John felt its beauty, the beauty of the silence, the necessity of it, the preparation it had provided. For he knew his own voice must fade, not disappear entirely, not be silenced immediately, but fade, diminish, take its proper place. For the true word to be heard, Jesus was the Word made flesh. And for that word to be heard clearly, John's voice needed to decrease. He must increase and I must decrease, he said. Perhaps the most beautiful statement in all of Scripture. No jealousy, no resentment, no clinging to relevance. He must increase. Jesus must grow in influence, in following, in recognition, and I must decrease, become smaller, less prominent, less central. This was not resignation. This was fulfillment. This was the completion of his purpose. Later, the desert grew quiet again. Time passed, ministry continued. But eventually, later, after more teaching, more baptisms, more confrontations, the desert grew quiet again, not with John's voice preaching, not with crowds coming, just quiet, empty, waiting once more. The prophet who had once shaken nations found himself in a prison cell, walls instead of wilderness, darkness instead of open sky. The reversal was stark. The prophet who had once shaken nations, whose voice had drawn thousands, whose message had challenged the powerful, found himself in a prison cell, confined, restricted, powerless in human terms, walls instead of wilderness, stone barriers instead of open space, darkness instead of open sky enclosed, cut off from the expanse he had known for so long. He who had spoken of freedom was now bound. The irony was cruel. He who had spoken of freedom preached repentance and liberation, announced the coming of the one who would set captives free, was now bound, literally imprisoned, chains on the man who had called others to break free from sin's chains. He who had heard heaven's voice began to doubt. Are you the one who is to come, or should we look for another? Even John, even the prophet, even the one who had seen the Spirit descend and heard the Father speak. In the darkness of that cell, in the silence of imprisonment, in the confusion of suffering, began to doubt. Not doubt God's existence, but doubt the specific identification. Are you the one who is to come? Is Jesus really the Messiah? Or should we look for another? Should we keep waiting? Did I get it wrong? But Jesus sent word. The blind see, the lame walk, the dead are raised, and the good news is preached to the poor. Jesus didn't rebuke the doubt, didn't scold the question, didn't condemn the wavering. He sent word, evidence, not explanation but demonstration. The blind see, the literally blind are seeing. The lame walk, the literally lame are walking. The dead are raised, actual resurrection is happening. And the good news is preached to the poor, not just to the powerful, not just to the righteous, but to the poor, the forgotten, the marginalized. It was not rebuke, but reassurance, the kind of answer only silence understands. The message wasn't, how dare you doubt. It was not rebuke. It was reassurance, comfort, confirmation, peace. The kind of answer only silence understands. Not an argument, not a proof, but an invitation to remember, to trust, to rest in what had been revealed even when present circumstances made it hard to see. John's days ended not with applause, but with peace. His execution came, Herod's cruel gift to his stepdaughter, the beheading of the prophet. John's days ended, his earthly ministry completed, not with applause, no crowds cheering, no public recognition of his greatness, but with peace, the settled confidence of one who had fulfilled his purpose, the quiet assurance of one who knew his voice had prepared the way. His voice was silenced by the cruelty of men, yet his message became eternal. The sound of repentance before redemption, the final cry of the old world before the new. They could kill his body. They could silence his voice, the physical sound of it, the audible proclamation. Was silenced by the cruelty of men, by human sin, by political manoeuvring, by the same kind of evil he had preached against. Yet his message became eternal. It didn't die with him. It couldn't be killed. The sound of repentance before redemption, the necessary preparation, the required turning. The final cry of the old world before the new, the last great prophet of the old covenant, announcing the arrival of the new. Even now, the desert remembers him, the physical place, the wilderness where he lived and preached. even now 2,000 years later. The desert remembers him. The landscape holds the echo. The sand carries the memory. When the wind passes through its valleys, it still carries his echo, not loud, not fearful, but steady. Prepare the way. The voice hasn't died. It's in the wind now, in the movement of air through ancient valleys, not loud, not shouting anymore, not fearful, not threatening or harsh, but steady, constant, persistent, reliable. Prepare the way, still calling, still speaking, still inviting, still pointing beyond itself to the one who came after. And in that echo, the wilderness still whispers what John knew all along, that silence is not empty, it is expectant, and the stillness that precedes God's arrival is always holy. The sun burned above the stones of Judea, and the wind moved like a living thing across the desert floor. Feel the heat, not the gentle warmth of spring sunshine, but the relentless, scorching heat that beats down on bare rock and sand. The sun burned, not shone pleasantly, not warmed comfortably, but burned. Above the stones of Judea, ancient stones, weathered and cracked, holding the memory of countless pilgrims, prophets, wanderers. And the wind moved like a living thing, not a gentle breeze, but wind with purpose, with personality, with presence, like a living thing breathing, shifting, moving with intention across the desert floor. No sound but the rustle of sand, no shelter but shadow, the absence of civilization, the removal of human noise, no voices, no music, no machinery, no sound but the rustle of sand, the whisper of grains shifting, moving, settling, the desert's own quiet music. No shelter but shadow, and even shadows are scarce here. No buildings, no trees, no refuge except the brief respite when rock blocks sun, when angle and time create a moment of shade before the heat returns. It was here that the Word himself, who once spoke creation into being, chose to become silence. The paradox is staggering. The Word himself, Logos, the divine expression, the one through whom all things were made, who once spoke creation into being. Let there be light, and there was light. The voice that called galaxies into existence, that set stars in their courses, that spoken matter obeyed, chose to become silence. Not was forced into silence, not accidentally fell silent, chose, deliberately, intentionally. The Word became silence. Jesus had just emerged from the waters of baptism, from the voice that declared him beloved, and immediately the Spirit led him into solitude. The sequence matters. He had just emerged from the waters wet dripping, standing in the Jordan River. From the voice, the Father's voice breaking through from heaven, that declared him beloved. This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. The affirmation, the public declaration, the confirmation of identity, and immediately no delay, no transition period, no time to process or prepare. The Spirit led him into solitude, not into ministry, not into crowds, not into teaching or healing, into solitude, into isolation, into aloneness. The heavens had opened to speak, and then they closed again. Heaven opened at the baptism. The sky tore apart. The barrier between divine and human became permeable. To speak, the Father spoke. The Spirit descended. It was dramatic, public, unmistakable. And then they closed again. The opening was temporary. The speaking ceased. The heavens returned to their ordinary state. The voice that had thundered now withdrew into stillness, from proclamation to silence, from revelation to hiddenness, from thunder to quiet. He walked among the rocks, fasting, his body growing thin, his thoughts clear and sharp as the desert air. Picture him walking, not rushing, not pacing anxiously, walking 1 foot in front of the other, moving through the landscape without destination. Among the rocks, the terrain of the desert, unforgiving, harsh, beautiful in its austerity. Fasting, voluntarily abstaining from food, deliberately denying the body what it naturally craves. His body growing thin, the physical cost of the fast becoming visible. Flesh reducing, strength depleting, weakness increasing. His thoughts clear and sharp as the desert air. But something else happened in the hunger. The fog that often clouds thinking lifted. His thoughts became clear, unclouded, focused, penetrating, and sharp, precise, cutting, able to distinguish truth from falsehood with perfect accuracy. As the desert air, which is crisp, clean, unobstructed by humidity or pollution. There was no audience, no disciples, no miracles. Strip away everything that would later define his ministry. No audience, no crowds pressing in, no people watching and evaluating, no disciples. He hadn't called them yet. He was utterly alone. No miracles, no healings to perform, no hungry to feed, no demonstrations of power. Only the long conversation between hunger and holiness, the internal dialogue, the wrestling, the choosing, between what the body demands and what the spirit requires, between hunger, the physical need, the legitimate craving, the natural desire for food, and holiness, the call to something higher, something purer, something that transcends immediate need. The wilderness was not his enemy, it was his proving ground. We think of wilderness as the place of danger, of testing in the negative sense of threat. But the wilderness was not his enemy. It wasn't attacking him. It wasn't opposing him. It was his proving ground, the place where he would be tested, not to make him fail, but to demonstrate what he was made of. The place where truth is revealed, where pretense is stripped away, where what is real emerges. For 40 days he was alone. 40, the biblical number of testing and transformation. Moses on the mountain for 40 days. Israel in the wilderness for 40 years. Noah in the ark through 40 days of rain. And now Jesus. For 40 days, not hours, not a weekend retreat, but 40 full days. He was alone, completely, utterly, with no human contact, no conversation, no companionship, just him and the Father and the silence between them. The Son of God learned the language of silence, the rhythm of obedience. Even he, in his humanity, had to learn. The Son of God, fully divine, yet fully human. Learned, acquired through experience, came to understand through practice. The language of silence, the way God speaks when words cease, the communication that happens in stillness. The rhythm of obedience, not just individual acts of compliance, but the pattern, the tempo, the flow of constant surrender to the Father's will. Every temptation that came was an echo of an older voice, the same whisper that had once twisted truth in a garden, now returning in the heat of the desert. The enemy returned. Every temptation, each one that arose, whether from within or spoken by the tempter, was an echo of an older voice, not a new strategy, the same one that had worked before, the same whisper subtle, reasonable sounding, almost helpful, that had once twisted truth in a garden, that spoke to Eve, that corrupted paradise, that introduced doubt where there had been trust, now returning persistent, patient, opportunistic, in the heat of the desert, in the weakness of hunger, in the vulnerability of isolation. If you are the Son of God, the challenge, the taunt, the test. If you are casting doubt, introducing uncertainty, the Son of God. Heaven just declared it, the Father just proclaimed it. But the enemy asks, are you sure? If you really are, then prove it. The challenge was not hunger, but identity. Not primarily about being hungry and wanting bread, but about who he is. about whether he believes what the Father said, about whether he will act from insecurity or from confidence in his identity. The enemy wanted to pull him out of the stillness, to make him prove what heaven had already declared. This is the strategy. Pull him out of the stillness, out of the trust, out of the rest, out of the settled assurance, into anxiety, into performance, into the need to demonstrate and prove, to make him prove through action, through miracle, through display, what heaven had already declared, what didn't need proving, what was already established. The Father had spoken. That should have been enough. The enemy wanted him to act as if it wasn't, but Jesus would not break the silence. He refused. He would not break the silence of trust, of rest, of settled identity. He would not let the enemy pull him into frantic demonstration. He answered not from fear, but from faith. His responses came not from a defensive posture, not from insecurity needing to prove itself, but from faith, from deep trust, from settled confidence, from rootedness in the Father's word. It is written. His weapon, his defense, his answer to every temptation. It is written in Scripture, in the eternal word of God, in truth that predates this moment and will outlast it. He spoke the word that had always been alive within him, not quoting something external to himself. He was the Word made flesh, and Scripture was alive in him, part of him, flowing from him naturally. Bread would come later, angels would come later, but first he would feed on trust. The things offered in temptation weren't wrong in themselves. Bread would come later. He would eat again. Angels would come later. They would minister to him, but first before the provision, before the rescue, before the relief. He would feed on trust, nourish himself on faith, sustain himself on obedience. He would learn, as every soul must learn, that the voice of God is strongest when the world grows quiet. This is universal truth, not just for Jesus, for every soul, every person, every heart, every life. Must learn, has to discover through experience, that the voice of God is strongest, most clear, most powerful, most unmistakable, when the world grows quiet, when noise ceases, when distraction fades, when all the other voices finally fall silent. The stones beneath his feet glowed in the sun, and he remembered Israel's own wilderness, the murmuring, the impatience, the hunger for what could be seen. The stones beneath his feet, the same desert, the same kind of terrain where Israel had wandered, glowed in the sun radiating heat, shimmering with light, and he remembered with his human mind, with the knowledge of Scripture, with awareness of history, Israel's own wilderness, their 40 years, their testing, the murmuring, the complaining, the grumbling, the constant dissatisfaction, the impatience wanting immediate relief, demanding instant provision, the hunger for what could be seen craving visible evidence, tangible proof, something they could touch and measure. Where they had failed, he stood still. The contrast is deliberate. Where the Israelites, God's chosen people, had failed, given into temptation, rebelled, turned away. He stood still, didn't waver, didn't compromise, didn't give in. Where they had grasped, he waited. Where they seized what was offered, where they took matters into their own hands, where they couldn't delay gratification, he waited, trusted, remained patient. The silence became his strength, not his weakness. This reverses our usual understanding. We think silence means vulnerability, means having nothing to say, means being without power. But the silence became his strength, the source of his power, the foundation of his endurance, not his weakness, not what made him vulnerable. The silence itself was power. The devil offered shortcuts, power without purpose, glory without grace, revelation without obedience. Each temptation was a shortcut, power without purpose, ruling the kingdoms of the world without the cross, without suffering, without redemption. Glory without grace, being recognized and worshipped without first dying, without serving, without sacrifice. Revelation without obedience. Testing God's protection by forcing his hand, by demanding miraculous intervention, by circumventing the ordinary path of trust. But Jesus understood that love never rushes. It fulfills in time. This is the deep wisdom. Love never rushes, doesn't take shortcuts, doesn't seek the easy path, doesn't try to skip necessary stages. It fulfills, accomplishes what it sets out to do, completes what it begins. In time, not on our schedule, not according to our impatience, but in the proper season, at the appointed moment. The true power of God is not in spectacle, but in surrender. Not in the dramatic display, not in the overwhelming show of force, but in surrender, in yielding, in trusting, in the strength of voluntary weakness. When the last temptation faded, the desert seemed to breathe again. After the testing ended, when the enemy departed, when the ordeal was complete, the desert seemed to breathe again, the oppressive atmosphere lifted, the spiritual weight eased, creation itself relaxed. The wind softened, no longer harsh, no longer relentless. The heat gentled, still present, but less brutal, less punishing. Angels came quietly, not as rescuers, but as companions. Finally, ministry arrived. But notice how. Angels came quietly, not with fanfare, not with drama, not as rescuers. He didn't need rescuing now. The testing was complete, but as companions coming alongside, offering presence and service, they did not shatter the silence, they honoured it. They entered the stillness respectfully, reverently. They didn't break the sacred quiet, but participated in it. The fast was over, but the lesson endured. The wilderness had not been punishment, it was initiation. Food would return, normal life would resume. But what was learned remained. The lesson endured, became permanent, shaped everything that followed. The wilderness had not been punishment, not divine anger, not retribution for sin. It was initiation, the beginning of something, the entry point into ministry, the foundation on which everything else would be built. From that stillness he emerged, not exhausted but radiant. After 40 days of fasting, you would expect collapse. Instead, from that stillness, from that extended silence, from that time alone with the Father, he emerged, came out, stepped forward, returned to the world. Not exhausted, not depleted, not weakened, not diminished, but radiant, glowing with something internal, shining with divine life, transformed by what had happened in the silence. The quiet had taught him what the crowds never could, that intimacy with the Father is forged in solitude. The quiet, the stillness, the silence, the aloneness, had taught him, imparted wisdom, revealed truth, formed understanding. What the crowds never could. Later thousands would follow him. They would see miracles. They would hear teaching. But they couldn't give him this. That intimacy with the Father is forged, created, formed, shaped like metal in fire, in solitude, in aloneness, in the absence of all others. He would heal multitudes, feed thousands, raise the dead, but he would always return to the lonely places to pray. The ministry that followed was public, dramatic, powerful. He would heal multitudes, countless sick and broken people made whole. Feed thousands bread multiplying in his hands. Raise the dead Lazarus, Jairus' daughter, the widow's son. But despite all this public ministry, despite the constant demands, despite the pressing needs. He would always return to the lonely places to pray, to mountains, to gardens, to anywhere he could be alone with the Father. Even the Son of God sought silence because silence was home. If he needed it, how much more do we? Even the Son of God, fully divine yet fully human, sought silence, made time for it, prioritized it, returned to it again and again, because silence was home, not just a practice, not just a discipline, but home, the place of belonging, the place of rest, the place where he was most himself. The world would come to know him by his miracles, but heaven knew him by his stillness. The world saw one thing, heaven saw another. The world would come to know him by his miracles, the signs and wonders, the dramatic acts, the public demonstrations of power. But heaven knew him, really knew him, understood him, recognized him by his stillness, by the hours in prayer, by the nights on mountains, by the silence before the Father. It was in those moments of retreat, on mountains and in gardens, that his human heart communed with divine eternity. The geography matters. Mountains, high places, removed from daily life, closer to heaven. Gardens, places of life and growth, quiet and beauty. That his human heart, the part of him that was fully man, that felt and thought and experienced as we do, communed, shared intimate fellowship, deep conversation beyond words, with divine eternity, with the Father, with the infinite, with that which is beyond time and space. Every word he later spoke carried the echo of this wilderness measured, patient, true. His later teaching, his parables, his pronouncements, every word he later spoke, each sermon, each conversation, each response to questions, carried the echo of this wilderness. You could hear it in his speech. The influence was unmistakable, measured, careful, deliberate, never rushed, patient, unhurried, willing to wait, never forcing, true, aligned with reality, consistent with the Father's heart, utterly reliable. And when the time came to face his final trial, when all the noise of betrayal and accusation filled the air, he did not answer. Years later, the culmination approaching, when the time came to face his final trial, standing before Pilate, before Herod, before the Sanhedrin, when all the noise of betrayal and accusation filled the air, false witnesses, angry shouts, demands for his death, he did not answer, stood silent, refused to defend himself. He stood silent before Pilate, silent before mockery, silent before death itself, silent before Pilate, the Roman governor asking questions, seeking answers, confused by this prisoner who wouldn't speak, silent before mockery, the soldiers spitting, mocking, crowning him with thorns, silent before death itself as the cross loomed, as the nails approached, as the end drew near. That same desert calm was still within him, the strength born of quiet trust. What he learned in the wilderness remained. That same desert calm, the peace forged in 40 days of fasting and testing, was still within him, hadn't faded, hadn't been lost in the busy years of ministry. The strength born of quiet trust, not from activity, not from achievement, but from silence, from solitude, from settled confidence in the Father. The wilderness had taught him the hardest truth of all, that silence is not weakness, it is authority clothed in peace. The lesson that shapes everything, the hardest truth of all, the one most difficult to accept, most counterintuitive to believe. That silence is not weakness, not inability to respond, not lack of power. It is authority, real power, true strength, unassailable confidence, clothed in peace, wearing the garment of tranquility, expressing itself through stillness. Even now, the Judean desert keeps that memory, present tense, the desert hasn't forgotten. Even now today, this moment, 2,000 years later, the Judean desert keeps that memory, holds it, preserves it. The stones hold the warmth of his footsteps. The very rocks remember where he walked. The wind still carries the faint pulse of his prayer, moving across the same terrain, whispering the same truths. And for those who enter their own barren places, he waits there still not with words, but with presence. The application becomes personal. For those who enter their own barren places, your wilderness, your desert season, your time of testing and hunger and aloneness, he waits there still, not absent, not distant, not uncaring, not with words, not always with audible guidance, not with clear instructions, but with presence, with nearness, with the reality of someone who has been there before you. In every wilderness of the soul, he is already there, whispering through stillness, "Be not afraid." When the first generations of believers felt the world grow loud with empire, argument and ambition, some of them turned their backs on it all. The world was changing. Rome had embraced Christianity, but in that embrace something was being lost. The faith that had been quiet, hidden, personal, was becoming public, political, powerful. Empire, the machinery of control, the weight of institutions, the bureaucracy of religion replacing the simplicity of devotion. Argument endless theological disputes, quarrels over words, debates that generated heat but no light. And ambition, the desire for position, for influence, for recognition within the new religious establishment. When the first generations of believers felt the world grow loud with all of this, some of them made a radical choice. They turned their backs on it all, not in bitterness, not in judgment of those who stayed, but in a deep knowing that they could not hear God's voice in the noise, could not find his face in the crowd, could not maintain the purity of their devotion in the machinery of religious empire. They were not running from humanity, they were running toward heaven. This is crucial to understand. Their withdrawal was not misanthropy. They did not hate people. They did not despise community. They did not reject human connection. They were not running from humanity, from love, from service, from care for others. They were running toward heaven, toward God, toward the source, toward the reality that the noise was obscuring. They understood that sometimes you must step away from people to learn how to truly love them. Sometimes you must leave the crowd to find what the crowd most needs. They sought a place where words ended and only presence remained. Words had become cheap. Arguments had multiplied them. Politics had weaponized them. Theology had complicated them beyond recognition. They sought a place, not just a physical location, but a spiritual condition, where words ended, where talking ceased, where explaining stopped, where the endless chatter finally ran out, and only presence remained, God's presence, their own authentic presence, the unmediated reality of being with being itself, without the buffer of language, without the distortion of debate. They became known as the desert fathers and mothers' souls who chose wilderness not for escape, but for encounter. History named them the desert fathers and mothers, men and women, young and old, educated and simple, from various backgrounds, various nations, various stories, but united in one choice, souls who chose wilderness, the harsh, inhospitable, uncomfortable wilderness, not the pleasant countryside, not the comfortable retreat centre, the actual desert, hot, dangerous, devoid of comforts, not for escape, not to get away from problems, not to avoid responsibilities, not to hide from life, but for encounter, to meet God, to face themselves, to discover what is real when everything fake is stripped away. Their cells were carved from cliffs, their days marked by prayer and labour. They lived simply. Their cells small caves, rough shelters, minimal spaces barely large enough to sleep in. Carved from cliffs using the natural stone, requiring nothing elaborate, content with the barest shelter. Their days marked by prayer and labour. Two rhythms: prayer, constant communion with God, regular offices, continuous breath prayers, the orientation of the soul toward heaven, and labour-weaving baskets, copying manuscripts, simple work that kept the hands busy while the heart prayed, that provided basic income while maintaining humility. The desert, once a place of exile, became a school of eternity. In Scripture, the desert was where you were sent when you were cursed, where Israel wandered for 40 years as punishment, where the scapegoat was driven bearing the people's sins, a place of exile, of banishment, of separation from the good land, from civilization, from blessing. But these monks transformed its meaning. The desert became a school, a place of learning, of formation, of education in the things that matter most, a school of eternity teaching lessons that last forever, forming character that transcends time, imparting wisdom that death cannot touch. There they learned that silence is not the absence of life, but the fullness of God's breath. In the desert's quiet, a profound truth revealed itself. Silence, which the world equates with emptiness, with nothing happening, with dead space to be filled, is not the absence of life, not void, not barren, but the fullness of God's breath, the same breath that hovered over the waters at creation, the same breath that was breathed into Adam's nostrils, the same breath that Jesus breathed on the disciples. That breath fills silence, makes it alive, makes it fertile, makes it the most vibrant reality they had ever encountered. One of them, Abba Anthony, left everything: wealth, family, inheritance. After hearing in church the words, "If you would be perfect, sell what you have, give to the poor, and follow me." Anthony was wealthy. He had a future. He had security. And then one day in church the gospel was read. "If you would be perfect, sell what you have, give to the poor, and follow me." Words he had probably heard before, but this time they struck differently. This time they landed in his heart with the force of divine command. He left everything. Not some things, not most things, everything. Wealth, his financial security, his comfort, his ease. Family, his connections, his relationships, his place in society. Inheritance, his future, his legacy, everything that was coming to him. He took those words not as metaphor but as invitation. Others interpreted those words spiritually, symbolically, as a general principle about detachment. But he took them literally, not as metaphor, not as a nice idea, not as poetry, not as hyperbole, but as invitation. Jesus was inviting him personally, calling him specifically, offering him a path that would cost everything and give everything. He disappeared into the Egyptian desert, armed with nothing but faith. He didn't prepare elaborately. He didn't wait for the perfect plan. He didn't gather supplies and supporters. He disappeared, simply left, walked away from his old life, into the Egyptian desert, the vast, hot, dangerous wilderness, armed with nothing but faith, no money, no provisions, no backup plan, no safety net, only trust that the one who called him would sustain him. The silence that met him was vast, crushing, yet strangely alive. When he arrived in the desert and stopped moving, the silence hit him, vast, stretching in every direction, deeper than he imagined, more complete than he had experienced. Crushing, oppressive at first, heavy, almost unbearable, yet strangely alive, not dead, not empty, pulsing with something he couldn't name, filled with a presence he couldn't see, vibrating with a reality beyond words. At first it frightened him. He wasn't immediately at peace. The silence was terrifying. The solitude was overwhelming. The absence of familiar voices, familiar distractions, familiar comforts, it stripped him bare and left him facing himself and God with nothing in between. At first it frightened him. He wanted to run. He wanted to fill the silence. He wanted to escape back to the world he knew. The solitude echoed with his own thoughts, the noise of pride and fear louder than any city. In the desert he discovered something unexpected. The external noise was gone, but the internal noise was deafening. The solitude echoed, bounced back at him, amplified, made inescapable. With his own thoughts, his judgments, his criticisms, his worries, his fantasies, the noise of pride, his ego defending itself, his self-importance demanding recognition, his need to be right and be seen as good, and fear-terror of insignificance, of suffering, of death, of God's judgment, of his own weakness. Louder than any city, the inner cacophony more overwhelming than the external chaos he had left. But over the years, the noise within began to die down, and something greater took its place. He didn't give up. He stayed. He persisted through the fear, through the noise, through the overwhelming confrontation with himself. Over the years, this wasn't quick. This wasn't easy. Years of sitting, years of praying, years of wrestling. The noise within began to die down. Gradually, slowly. The voices grew quieter. The fears lost their power. The pride diminished, and something greater took its place. Not emptiness, not nothing, but something greater: peace, presence, love, God himself filling the space that ego once occupied. He discovered that the desert was not empty, it was crowded with presence. What appeared barren revealed itself as full. The desert was not empty, not devoid of life, of meaning, of encounter. It was crowded with presence, God's presence everywhere, in the sand, in the sky, in the silence, in the stillness, angels, demons. The spiritual realities invisible to those who live only in the noise. The communion of saints, the cloud of witnesses, presence upon presence upon presence. Each grain of sand shimmered with God's patience. The desert became sacramental. Each grain of sand, countless insignificant identical grains, shimmered with God's patience, reflected it, embodied it. The patience that forms mountains one grain at a time, the patience that endures through millennia, the patience that never rushes, never forces, never gives up. Each grain a small witness to the character of the one who made it. Each dawn felt like creation happening again. Every morning the sun rose, and it wasn't routine. It wasn't just another day. Each dawn felt like creation happening again. New, fresh, the first day. God speaking light into darkness. The separation of day from night. The gift of another beginning. The mercy of a new start. Creation not as a past event, but as a present, ongoing reality. The more he stopped speaking, the more the world began to speak to him. This is the paradox. The more he stopped speaking, ceased his own words, silenced his own interpretations, quit his own running commentary, the more the world began to speak to him. The wind carried messages, the stars told stories, the silence itself communicated. Creation was speaking all along, but his words had drowned it out. In his silence, he could finally hear. People began to seek him out, drawn by a peace they could not name. Word spread. Stories travelled. Of the man who lived alone in the desert, who had renounced everything, who radiated something different. People began to seek him out, travelling long distances, crossing dangerous terrain, drawn by a peace and they didn't know what it was, couldn't articulate it, had never experienced it, but they recognized it when they encountered him. They could not name it, but they needed it. They asked him for words, and he often gave them silence instead. They came with questions. They wanted teaching. They needed answers. They asked him for words, and he often gave them silence instead, not because he was withholding, not because he didn't care, but because silence was often the truest answer, the deepest teaching, the most honest response. Some questions cannot be answered with words. Some needs cannot be met with explanations. Some seekers need silence more than speech. When they pressed him, he said simply, "From our silence is born prayer, and from prayer comes love." When they insisted, when they wouldn't accept silence, when they demanded something verbal, he said simply, not elaborately, not in long discourses, simply, "From our silence is born prayer." Silence is not the absence of prayer, it is the womb of prayer, the place where prayer gestates and grows and emerges. And from prayer comes love. Prayer births love. Communion with God produces love for people. Encounter with divine love generates human love. Others followed Pachomius, who built communities of prayer, Macarius, who said that to be alone with God is to discover that nothing else matters. Anthony was not alone for long. Others followed, each with their own calling, their own charism, their own expression of desert spirituality. Pachomius, who built communities of prayer, realizing that some are called to solitude, but others to communal monasticism, creating structures for shared desert life. Macarius, who said that to be alone with God is to discover that nothing else matters. Not that other things are bad, but that in comparison with God, in the light of his presence, everything else fades into relative insignificance. The women came too, Amma Syncletica, who taught that there are many who live in the desert and behave as though in the city, and they are far from God. But there are others who live in the city and make of their hearts a desert, and they are near to God. This was not only a movement of men, the women came too, equally radical, equally devoted, equally wise. Amma Syncletica mother, teacher, spiritual guide, who taught profound truth. Location is not what matters. There are many who live in the desert, physically present in the wilderness, externally in the right place, and behave as though in the city hearts still full of noise, minds still cluttered with ambition, souls still seeking recognition, and they are far from God. Physical location alone doesn't create spiritual proximity, but there are others who live in the city physically present in the noise, the crowds, the chaos, and make of their hearts a desert, create inner stillness, inner silence, inner solitude. And they are near to God. The desert is a condition of the heart, not just a place on a map. They discovered that the true wilderness is not found in sand but in silence, the inner stillness where the soul stands bare before its maker. This is the deepest realization. The true wilderness, the real desert that matters, is not found in sand, not primarily about location, not mainly about physical environment, but in silence. The inner stillness, the quieting of all the voices within, where the soul stands bare, undefended, unadorned, without pretense or protection, before its maker, face to face with God, nothing hidden, nothing between, complete vulnerability and complete truth. They waged no wars, led no armies, yet their quiet transformed generations. They had no political power, no military might, no institutional authority. They waged no wars, led no armies, held no positions of worldly influence, yet their quiet, their silence, their prayers, their lives of hidden devotion transformed generations, changed the church, shaped theology, redirected spirituality, influenced millions who never met them but encountered their wisdom centuries later. Their wisdom was simple: speak little, judge less, work with your hands, pray with your breath, and when the night grows long, remember that God is nearer than your thoughts. The wisdom they passed down was not complex, not elaborate theological systems, simple. Speak little words are precious, use them sparingly. Judge less mercy matters more than being right. Work with your hands, labour keeps you humble and productive. Pray with your breath, make prayer as constant as breathing. And when the night grows long, when darkness comes, when suffering hits, when faith is tested, remember that God is nearer than your thoughts, closer than your own mind, more present than your own awareness. They said the hardest battle was not with demons, but with distraction. Spiritual warfare was real to them. They encountered demons, fought temptations, wrestled with darkness. But they said the hardest battle was not with demons, not the dramatic confrontations, but with distraction, the subtle, constant pull away from presence, the endless small things that fragment attention, the thoughts that scatter focus, the impulses that prevent stillness. The world will try to pull you out of stillness, to make you measure, compare, justify. The world, the system, the culture, the noise has an agenda. It will try to pull you out of stillness, constantly, relentlessly, to make you measure your progress, your worth, your success, to compare yourself to others, your journey to theirs, to justify your choices, your path, your existence, all of which destroys stillness and create anxiety. But the one who stays silent in love becomes a mirror of God. Resistance is possible. The one who stays, who refuses to be pulled out, who maintains stillness despite the pull. Silent in love, not silent in coldness or withdrawal, but in love. Loving silence, silent loving, becomes a mirror of God, reflects his character, shows his face, reveals his nature to a world that has forgotten what he looks like. The monks learned to live in rhythm with the desert itself. Days of heat and nights of stars. They adapted to the environment, learned its patterns, lived in rhythm with the desert itself, not fighting it, not resisting its nature, but aligning with it. Days of heat enduring, accepting, working with the scorching sun, and nights of stars cool, clear, vast expanses of heaven visible without light pollution, inviting contemplation of infinity. Their prayers rose with the dawn and fell with the dark. Their spiritual life followed natural rhythms. Their prayers rose with the dawn-morning prayers, Lords, the greeting of new light, and fell with the dark evening prayers, Vespers, Compline, the surrender into night. Not arbitrary schedules, but rhythms that matched creation itself, that aligned human worship with the cycles God built into the world. They sang not to be heard, but to join creation's quiet worship. When they sang psalms, chanted prayers, lifted their voices. They sang not to be heard, not for an audience, not for approval, not for performance, but to join creation's quiet worship, the worship that stones and stars and sand were already offering, the praise that all creation continuously sings. They added their voices to that eternal chorus. When they spoke, their words were few, but every word had weight, like stones in a river. Speech became precious. When they spoke, which was rarely, their words were few. They didn't waste words, didn't fill air with empty talk, but every word had weight, mattered, carried significance, like stones in a river, solid, substantial, each one chosen, each one placed deliberately, each one creating ripples. And in their silence, the church found its heartbeat again. While the institutional church grew noisy, political, complicated. In their silence, in the quiet prayers of these desert dwellers, the church found its heartbeat again, remembered its purpose, reconnected with its source, rediscovered what it had nearly lost in the transition from persecuted minority to imperial religion. While cities argued over doctrine, the desert prayed. The contrast was stark. While cities, the centres of power, the seats of bishops, the locations of councils, argued over doctrine, debating the nature of Christ, fighting over theological formulas, condemning heresies, the desert prayed, simply, continuously, without needing to resolve every mystery, without demanding that every question be answered. While rulers fought for crowns, the monks bowed for mercy. Political power was being contested. While rulers fought for crowns, literal and metaphorical, battling for authority, scheming for position, killing for power, the monks bowed for mercy, not seeking power, but seeking grace, not fighting for dominance, but surrendering in humility, not taking crowns, but bowing before the one true King. The stillness of their lives became the foundation upon which faith could rest again. Their quiet wasn't passive, it was generative. The stillness of their lives, their commitment to silence, solitude, simplicity, became the foundation, the bedrock, the solid ground, the stable base, upon which faith could rest again. Faith that had been shaken by institutionalization, faith that had been confused by political Christianity, faith that needed to remember its essence. They left behind no monuments, only saying small, luminous fragments of truth. They built no cathedrals, erected no statues, created no elaborate institutions. They left behind no monuments, nothing grand, nothing imposing, nothing designed to last millennia as physical structure. Only sayings, small statements, brief words of wisdom, luminous fragments of truth, like gems, like stars, small but radiant, brief but eternal. Sit in your cell, and your cell will teach you everything. One saying captures their wisdom. Sit in your cell. Stay put. Don't run. Don't escape. Remain in the small, uncomfortable, boring space, and your cell will teach you everything. The space itself becomes the teacher. Solitude reveals. Confinement liberates. The limitations of the cell become the doorway to infinite wisdom. He who truly knows himself is greater than he who raises the dead. Maichu. Another saying shows their priorities. Miracles are impressive. He who raises the dead spectacular power, obvious holiness, undeniable authority. But he who truly knows himself, who has faced his own heart, who has acknowledged his own darkness, who has seen himself clearly without illusion, is greater. Self-knowledge is more valuable than supernatural power. To be silent is to let God fight for you. And another reveals their strategy. To be silent, to refrain from defending yourself, from arguing your case, from proving your point, is to let God fight for you. To trust that he will vindicate, that he will defend, that his justice is better than your self-justification. Centuries later, their silence still speaks. Time has passed, empires have fallen, languages have changed, cultures have shifted, but centuries later, their silence still speaks. The paradox holds. Their refusal to speak loudly continues to communicate. Their withdrawal continues to teach. Their hiddenness continues to shine. It whispers through monasteries, through mountain chapels, through the hearts of those who long for more than noise. Where does it speak? It whispers through monasteries Benedictine, Cistercian, Carthusian communities that trace their lineage to the desert, through mountain chapels, small remote places of prayer scattered across continents, through the hearts of those who long for more than noise. Every person in every age who feels the emptiness of constant input, who hungers for something deeper, who knows there must be more than the endless chatter. Their solitude became a legacy, a reminder that God is not found in the crowd's shout, but in the quiet endurance of faith. What they lived became a legacy, passed down, inherited by subsequent generations. Their solitude, their choice to be alone with God, became a reminder, a continuing witness, an ongoing testimony that God is not found in the crowd's shout, not in the loudest voice, not in the most popular movement, not in the biggest gathering, but in the quiet endurance of faith, in the persistent, humble, hidden faithfulness that continues when no one is watching. And even now, if you walk the old paths of Scetis or Nitria, you can feel it, the hush that holds eternity. The places still exist. The geography remains. And even now, in our modern age, in our noisy time, if you walk the old paths, the ancient routes the monks travelled, of Scetis or Nitria, locations in Egypt where the desert monastics gathered, you can feel it. Something still lingers. The hush that holds eternity, the silence that has absorbed centuries of prayer, the atmosphere that remembers holiness. The sand moves, the wind sighs, and somewhere between them you can almost hear the breath of the saints still praying, still waiting, still listening. The physical elements continue their ancient patterns. The sand moves blown by wind, shifted by time, constantly changing yet forever the same. The wind sighs breathing across the dunes, whistling through the rocks. And somewhere between them, in the space where sand and wind meet, where earth and air touch, you can almost hear, not quite, not definitively, but almost, the breath of the saints, those who lived and prayed and died in this place, still praying, still waiting, still listening. The deserts of the world have not vanished, they have only changed shape. Physical deserts still exist, of course. Sahara, Mojave, Gobi. They stretch across continents, vast and unforgiving. But the deserts of the world have not vanished from human experience. They remain, but they have only changed shape. They've adapted, transformed, relocated from geography to psychology, from landscape to interior terrain. They live now in cities filled with sound, in screens that never sleep, in the constant hum of doing. The desert, the place of isolation, of testing, of confrontation with yourself and with God lives, now not in barren wastelands, but in the paradox of crowded spaces. In cities filled with sound where you can be surrounded by millions and still feel utterly alone. In screens that never sleep glowing blue at 2 a.m, always available, always demanding attention, always promising connection while delivering only distraction. In the constant hum of doing the never-ending task list, the productivity culture, the sense that you must always be accomplishing something or you're falling behind. Silence has become the rarest luxury. Once it was common, expected, built into the rhythm of days and seasons. Now silence has become the rarest luxury, harder to find than gold, more expensive than any purchase. You can buy almost anything, but you cannot buy silence. You must create it, carve it out, defend it against 1,000 invasions. It has become a luxury that most cannot afford, not because of cost, but because of courage. It takes bravery to be quiet when everything around you screams. Yet the same God who met Elijah, who strengthened David, who spoke to John and Jesus and the monks of old, still waits to be found in this new wilderness, inside the human heart. History is full of encounters with God in lonely places. The same God, not a different version, not an updated model, not adapted for modern times. The same eternal, unchanging God, who met Elijah in the cave after his flight from Jezebel, who strengthened David in the wilderness of Judea as he hid from Saul, who spoke to John on the island of Patmos, who called Jesus into the desert for 40 days, who drew monks into caves and hermitages for centuries, still waits to be found, present tense, right now, not only in the past, not just in ancient times, still waiting, still available, still seeking those who will seek him, in this new wilderness, the contemporary desert, the modern wasteland, the current place of testing, inside the human heart, not out there somewhere, not in a distant place you must journey to, inside, in the interior space, in the landscape of your own soul. You feel it when the noise of life grows unbearable. There comes a moment or many moments when the volume becomes too much, when the demands pile too high, when the input exceeds your capacity to process. You feel it, not just think it. Feel it in your body, in your nerves, in the tightness of your chest and the tension in your shoulders. When the noise of life grows unbearable, when you cannot take one more notification, one more expectation, one more piece of information demanding your attention. When the mind loops through questions with no answers, when even prayer feels like talking into wind. The mental loops, the same worries cycling endlessly, the same fears returning no matter how many times you try to dismiss them. Questions with no answers. Not because the answers don't exist, but because you cannot access them. You ask and ask and ask, and nothing comes back. When even prayer feels like talking into wind words disappearing into nothing, no sense of being heard, no response, no relief. Just your voice speaking into emptiness. You wake at night, not to the cry of owls or jackals, but to the glow of a phone, the weight of unspoken worry. The ancient night had its own sounds, owls hunting, jackals calling, the natural symphony of darkness. But you wake at night to different things. To the glow of a phone, that artificial blue light pulling you from sleep, promising something important, delivering only anxiety. To the weight of unspoken worry, the things you haven't said, the conversations you haven't had, the fears you haven't voiced, all pressing down on your chest in the darkness. Anxiety hums through the bloodstream like static. It's not loud, it's not dramatic, it's more insidious than that. Anxiety hums a constant low-frequency vibration that never quite stops. Through the bloodstream, physical, biological, felt in the body, not just the mind, like static, that white noise that isn't quite sound but isn't quite silence either. Interference, disruption, the sense that something is wrong even when nothing specific is wrong. The wilderness now wears the face of restlessness. The biblical wilderness was a physical place, hot, dry, dangerous, empty. The wilderness now is different in form, but similar in function. It wears the face of restlessness, that inability to settle, to be still, to be content. The constant feeling that you should be somewhere else, doing something else, being someone else, moving, striving, reaching, never arriving. But beneath that restlessness, a calling remains. Under the surface chaos, under the noise and anxiety and constant motion, something persists. A calling, an invitation, a summons, a voice that has not given up even when you've stopped listening, remains still there, still present, still speaking even when drowned out by everything else. The still small voice still whispers, "Be still." The same voice Elijah heard after the wind and earthquake and fire. The still small voice not competing with the noise, not shouting to be heard, but whispering. Still whispers, hasn't stopped, hasn't changed tactics, hasn't adapted to match our volume. Be still. The same two words, the same ancient invitation, the same impossible seeming command in a world that never stops moving. It is the same invitation, only now it must pierce through the buzz of modern fear. The invitation hasn't changed. God's desire for communion hasn't evolved, but the obstacles have multiplied. Only now it must pierce through, not just reach through or speak through, but pierce, like an arrow penetrating armor, through the buzz of modern fear, not ancient fears of lions and enemies, but contemporary anxieties about relevance and security and meaning. The buzz, that constant background hum of worry that characterizes our age. For the greatest silence is no longer external. It is inner quiet, the discipline of peace in a world addicted to noise. You can find external silence, though it's difficult. You can turn off devices, close doors, find a quiet room. But the greatest silence is no longer external. The hardest quiet to achieve is not in your environment, but in your interior. Inner quiet. The stilling of mental chatter. The calming of emotional turbulence. The settling of spiritual restlessness. The discipline of peace, not peace that comes naturally, but peace that must be practiced, cultivated, chosen repeatedly. In a world addicted to noise, truly addicted, craving it, unable to function without it, experiencing withdrawal symptoms in its absence. We fill our lives with motion because we fear emptiness. This is the deeper diagnosis. The constant activity isn't just about productivity or achievement. We fill our lives with motion deliberately, compulsively, desperately, because we fear emptiness. What if there's nothing there when we stop? What if the void opens up? What if we're confronted with meaninglessness or loneliness or the reality we've been avoiding? We talk, scroll, consume, build and run. Yet somewhere inside, a part of us still aches for the slow rhythm of the desert wind. The strategies of avoidance are varied. We talk, constantly communicating but rarely connecting. Scroll, endlessly consuming content that leaves us empty. Consume, buying, acquiring, accumulating things that cannot satisfy. Build, constructing careers and identities and reputations. And run, always moving, always busy, always outpacing whatever we're fleeing. Yet somewhere inside, despite all this activity, beneath all this noise, a part of us still aches, not just wants or wishes, but aches with deep longing. For the slow rhythm of the desert wind, for something unhurried, something natural, something that moves at the pace of breath rather than the pace of notifications. The desert wind doesn't rush, it doesn't multitask, it simply moves slowly, steadily, at its own ancient pace. That ache is not weakness, it is memory. We interpret this longing as a flaw, as inability to adapt to modern life, as weakness in the face of contemporary demands. But that ache is not weakness, it's not failure. It is memory deep, cellular, ancient memory. The soul remembers Eden, not intellectually, not as a story read in Genesis, but remembers with the kind of knowing that predates language. It remembers walking with God in the cool of the day before the world learned to shout, the original communion, the first relationship, walking with God, not striving toward Him, not working for Him, not even worshipping Him in the formal sense, just walking together in the cool of the day, the gentle evening, the peaceful hour, the time of rest after work, before the world learned to shout, before noise became normal, before chaos became constant, before we forgot what peace felt like. To live in this time and still find silence is to resist the empire of noise. This is revolutionary language. Empire, not just preference or culture, but empire, a force that rules, that demands allegiance, that punishes resistance. The empire of noise, the system that requires constant input, perpetual availability, endless productivity. To live in this time and still find silence is not just a nice idea. It is resistance. It is rebellion. It is refusing to bow to the dominant power. It is to carve out a holy place in the heart, a small sanctuary untouched by chaos. The work is active. It is to carve out like a sculptor removing stone, like a gardener clearing ground, deliberately, intentionally, against resistance. A holy place, not just any space, but sacred space. Set apart, dedicated, in the heart, not in your schedule or your home necessarily, but in your interior, your soul. A small sanctuary doesn't have to be vast or impressive. Small is enough. Untouched by chaos, protected, preserved, kept safe from the invasion of noise and demand and anxiety. You do not need to flee to mountains or caves. The wilderness has already found you. The ancient hermits withdrew from civilization to seek God, but you do not need to flee. Physical withdrawal is not required, not necessary. To mountains or caves, those traditional places of solitude. The wilderness has already found you. It's already here, already present in your life. You're already in it, whether you recognize it or not. You carry it wherever you go. The wilderness is not a location anymore. It's a condition, a state. You carry it wherever you go. To work, to home, to the store, to bed. It's with you because it's in you. The isolation, the testing, the confrontation with yourself and God all portable now. All internal. The task now is not to escape, but to listen within it. The goal has shifted. The task now in this age, with this form of wilderness, is not to escape, not to find a way out, not to avoid it, not to wait for it to end, but to listen within it, to find God not after the wilderness, but in it, to hear his voice not when circumstances change, but while they remain difficult. Sometimes the silence comes in exhaustion, not always as a chosen discipline, not always as a spiritual practice. Sometimes the silence comes in exhaustion when you have no choice, when you simply cannot go on, when your body and soul force you to stop whether you want to or not. When your strength is gone, when ambition fades, when plans fall apart, you find yourself forced to stop. When your strength is gone, not just tired, but depleted, emptied, unable to summon the energy to keep striving. When ambition fades, those goals and dreams and visions that drove you suddenly lose their power, suddenly seem hollow. When plans fall apart, despite your efforts, despite your control, despite your careful strategies, you find yourself forced to stop, not choosing it, not wanting it, forced by circumstances beyond your control. And in that stopping, God begins to speak again, not through new visions, but through presence. The irony is profound, in that stopping the stopping you resisted, the stopping you feared. God begins to speak again, not with new revelations necessarily, not through new visions, not dramatic experiences or supernatural encounters, but through presence, simple, quiet, unspectacular presence, being there, being with you, being enough. He says nothing and yet says everything. I am still here. No words, no explanations, no answers to your questions. He says nothing. Silent presence, and yet says everything that matters. The message beneath the silence, the meaning communicated without language. I am still here. Present tense, current reality. Despite your exhaustion, despite your failure, despite your plans falling apart, still here, haven't left, haven't given up, haven't withdrawn. Waiting becomes prayer. The transformation begins. Activities you thought were empty become sacred. Waiting, which you experienced as wasted time, as frustration, as punishment, becomes prayer. Not formal petitions, not articulated requests, but the posture of waiting itself becomes communion with God. the act of staying when you want to flee, of remaining when you want to run, of continuing to show up even when nothing seems to happen. Breathing becomes worship, even simpler. Breathing, the most basic, automatic, unconscious act, becomes worship. Each inhale an acknowledgement of dependence. Each exhale a release of control. The rhythm of breath itself, praising the one who first breathed life into clay. Tears become confession. You don't have to formulate words. You don't have to organize your thoughts. Tears become confession, the overflow of emotion, the release of what you've been holding, the honest expression of pain and failure and need. God reads tears, understands them, receives them as the truest form of prayer. You begin to realize that not all healing comes from answers. Some comes from acceptance. This is a crucial shift. The healing you've been seeking through understanding, through figuring it out, through getting explanations. You begin to realize that not all healing comes from answers. Some wounds aren't healed by knowing why. Some comes from acceptance, not resignation, not defeat, but the deep peace of surrendering the need to understand, of trusting even when you cannot see. The wilderness does not always end when you leave it. It ends when you stop fighting it. Another reversal of expectation. You've been waiting for circumstances to change, for the trial to pass, for the difficult season to end. But the wilderness does not always end when you leave it. Sometimes you carry it for years. It ends when you stop fighting it, when you cease resisting, when you quit demanding that things be different and start accepting what is, when you realize that even in your loneliness, God has never been absent. The final realization that changes everything, even in your loneliness, the experience that felt most like abandonment, most like evidence of God's distance. God has never been absent, not for a moment, not even when you couldn't feel him, not even when you couldn't see him, never absent, always present, always near, always holding you even when you couldn't sense his hands. In this inner desert, anxiety slowly gives way to awareness. The landscape shifts. In this inner desert, the internal wilderness you've been learning to inhabit rather than flee. Anxiety slowly gives way to awareness, not instantly, not suddenly, slowly, gradually, over time, almost imperceptibly. Anxiety, the fear-driven state that dominated, gives way, makes room for, is replaced by awareness, clear seeing, honest acknowledgement, conscious presence to reality as it actually is. You begin to see how much of your fear was built from illusions, control, comparison, expectation. With awareness comes revelation. You begin to see not all at once, but piece by piece, how much of your fear was built from illusions. Not reality, but false beliefs. Control the illusion that you could manage outcomes, determine results, prevent bad things from happening. Comparison, the illusion that measuring yourself against others would bring satisfaction or security. Expectation, the illusion that life should match your plans, that God should operate according to your timeline. They fall away one by one, like dust shaken from sandals. These illusions don't require violent removal. They fall away naturally, gently. One by one, not all at once but successively, each in its time. Like dust shaken from sandals, the simple act of walking forward causes them to release. They were never firmly attached. They only seemed permanent because you kept holding them. In their place grows something quieter, gratitude, surrender, faith. Nature abhors a vacuum. In their place where the illusions once lived, where anxiety once dominated, grows something. Not forcefully planted, but organically developing. Something quieter, not loud or dramatic or attention-seeking. gratitude, the ability to see gifts where you once saw only lack, surrender, the peace of releasing control you never really had, faith, the quiet confidence that even when you don't understand, you are held. The saints of this age are not those who flee the world, but those who find stillness within it. A new kind of holiness is required. The saints of this age, the truly spiritual people, the ones walking closely with God, are not those who flee the world. Withdrawal is not the mark of sanctity anymore, but those who find stillness within it, in the middle of jobs and families and responsibilities, in the midst of cities and noise and chaos, finding the interior quiet while remaining engaged with life. The monk in the city, the mother at dawn, the worker in a crowd hall can learn to listen. The contemplative life is no longer confined to monasteries, the monk in the city maintaining spiritual discipline amid urban chaos. The mother at dawn finding sacred silence in the early hours before the household wakes. The worker in a crowd practicing presence while surrounded by people. All can learn to listen. This is not reserved for a special class of people, not limited to those with particular vocations. Everyone can learn. Silence is not about distance, it is about attention. This is the key. Silence is not about distance, not about how far you are from noise or people or activity. It is about attention, where you direct your focus, what you choose to notice, how you orient your awareness. You can be in a quiet place and not experience silence. You can be in a crowded place and find it, because it's not primarily about external conditions. It's about internal orientation. The voice of God does not shout above the noise. It waits beneath it, steady as a heartbeat. God has not changed his communication style to compete with our age. The voice of God does not shout above the noise, doesn't try to be louder than everything else, doesn't force its way through. It waits beneath it, under the surface, below the clamour, in the deeper place. Steady as a heartbeat, constant, regular, reliable. Always there. Always speaking. Always calling. You just have to learn to hear at a different frequency, and when you begin to hear it, even faintly, life itself changes texture. Something fundamental shifts. When you begin to hear it, not fully, not perfectly, not constantly, even faintly, just the slightest perception, the barest awareness, the beginning of recognition. Life itself changes texture. Not just your spiritual life or your prayer life. Life itself. The very fabric of existence feels different, looks different, means something different. The ordinary becomes sacred. This is transfiguration. The ordinary, the mundane, the routine, the everyday becomes sacred, not replaced by something holy, but revealed as holy, recognized as carrying the presence of God all along. The sound of rain becomes a psalm, rain falling on roof or pavement, once just weather. Now the sound of rain becomes a psalm, praise, prayer, a song of creation joining the eternal chorus. The pause before speaking becomes prayer, that moment of hesitation before words, the breath before response. The pause before speaking becomes prayer, a micro moment of surrender, of seeking wisdom, of inviting God into the conversation about to unfold. The act of listening becomes communion, listening to another person, listening to silence, listening to your own heart. The act of listening becomes communion participation in God's own attentiveness, sharing in his presence, experiencing connection that transcends words. The wilderness within does not promise escape, it promises transformation. Final clarity about what this journey offers. The wilderness within this inner desert you've been learning to inhabit does not promise escape, won't remove you from difficulty, won't eliminate pain, won't solve all problems. It promises transformation, change, becoming, being remade from the inside out. The same God who shaped prophets in caves now shapes you in quiet moments of surrender. Historical continuity with your experience. The same God, the eternal craftsman, the divine potter who shaped prophets in caves, who formed Moses and Elijah and John the Baptist through wilderness encounters, now shapes you, present tense, currently at work, in quiet moments of surrender, not in dramatic experiences necessarily, but in the small, repeated choices to let go, to trust, to stop fighting. Every breath becomes a journey, every silence a doorway into his peace. The scale shifts from vast to intimate. Every breath not just special breaths, not just prayer breaths, but every single one becomes a journey, a step forward, a movement toward God. Every silence, each pause, each gap, each moment of quiet becomes a doorway, an entrance, an opening into his peace, the peace that surpasses understanding, the rest that satisfies deepest longings. And perhaps that is the secret the ancients always knew, that the wilderness is not somewhere you go to find God. There comes a time in every pilgrim's walk when heaven seems far away. You pray and nothing stirs. You cry out and there is no reply. You open scripture and the words feel dry as dust. You wait and wait again until waiting itself becomes the only prayer left. This is the silence that tests faith, the place where even hope holds its breath. It is tempting to think that silence means absence, that unanswered prayers are evidence of neglect. But heaven's quiet is not neglect. It is depth. It is the slow language of eternity shaping mortal hearts to endure love's weight. For love that answers instantly stays shallow, but love that delays teaches trust. Every unanswered prayer is not denial, it is preparation. Heaven waits until your desire ripens into something strong enough to carry blessing without breaking. There were times when even the greatest among the faithful knew this silence. Job sat among ashes, asking why the righteous suffer. The psalmist cried, "How long, O Lord? Will you forget me forever?" Mary and Martha watched their brother die, believing help would come sooner. Even the Son of God on the cross tasted the stillness of unanswered prayer. My God, why have you forsaken me? And yet every one of those moments held a hidden mercy. Job's silence became revelation. The psalmist's despair became worship. Lazarus rose again, and through the cry of abandonment came the redemption of the world. God was not absent in their waiting. He was working in ways they could not yet see. When heaven is quiet, it does not mean that your words have vanished into emptiness. It means they have gone deeper than you know. The silence between prayer and response is the sacred space where faith matures. Like a seed buried in the ground, unseen but alive, prayer often germinates in darkness before it breaks the surface of time. If God answered everything instantly, trust would never grow. We would follow for reward, not for love. But silence reveals motive. It purifies longing. It teaches the soul to seek the giver more than the gift. Sometimes the answer comes not in a change of circumstance, but in a change of vision. Heaven's silence becomes the mirror in which you see what you truly need. Perhaps the thing you asked for was never withheld. It was being transformed. There are prayers that are too small for the magnitude of God's plan, and He withholds them only to give something larger. There are also prayers that must be delayed because they touch the lives of others whose stories are still unfolding. The divine timing that frustrates us is the same timing that saves us. You begin to see it gradually, the mercy hidden in waiting, the love hidden in loss. When heaven seems quiet, it is often listening more deeply than before. Silence is not God's refusal to speak. It is His way of drawing you into a conversation too profound for words. And when the answer finally comes, sometimes softly, sometimes suddenly, it will carry the weight of eternity. You will look back on the long nights of silence and see that they were not empty. They were filled with unseen grace. For even in quiet, the heart of God is never still. His silence is not distance, it is depth. It is the space where his thoughts gather strength before they arrive as light. And though you may not hear his voice, he hears every beat of your heart. In time, you learn to rest even in the unanswered. You learn that prayer is not a transaction, but a communion. That God's greatest gift is not always response, but presence. And when that truth settles deep within you, the silence no longer feels like void. It feels like love too vast for sound. There comes a point when the long quiet breaks not with thunder or vision, but with understanding. It does not shatter the silence, it completes it. The stillness that once felt endless suddenly hums with meaning, like light dawning on water. You begin to see what you couldn't see before, that silence was never a pause in God's presence, but a doorway into it. The sound of return is not a noise, it is recognition. The heart returns to the rhythm it was made for. The soul that wandered through questions and shadows begins to feel the familiar warmth again, not because the circumstances have changed, but because perception has. You realize that revelation is not something new coming from outside. It is the unveiling of what was already there. Moses once climbed Sinai and found God in darkness. Elijah heard him in stillness. The disciples met him on a shore at dawn, the nets heavy with grace they did not expect. Revelation has always sounded like remembrance, the heart remembering what it once knew in Eden, that God was never far. The silence becomes sound not of speech, but of recognition. The stillness that once frightened you now sings. You hear it in ordinary things, in wind that bends a tree, in water over stone, in your own steady breathing. The whole world becomes a conversation again. Every leaf whispers something eternal. Every act of kindness hums with divinity. The longer you walk with God, the more you realize that his revelations rarely arrive as flashes of lightning. They come as clarity. They come when the eyes of the heart open. They come when what you feared most, silence, turns out to be the very place of encounter. The sound of return is also repentance, but not in shame. It is the soft turning of the soul back toward its center. The Hebrew word for repentance means to turn back, to return home. And that is what silence prepares, the homecoming of the Spirit. You come back not as a stranger seeking approval, but as a beloved remembering belonging. In the hush, you begin to hear again the voice that formed you, the same one that spoke your name before time began. It says not, "Where have you been?" but "I have been here all along." It speaks not in accusation, but in embrace. You do not need to explain your wandering, you only need to rest in the arms that never let you go. And when you listen closely, you realize that the silence itself has always been singing. The spaces between your prayers were filled with God's breath sustaining you. The long nights of waiting were filled with angels you could not see. The pain that seemed meaningless was shaping empathy, humility, compassion. What you thought was absence was alignment. You understand now why the prophets and poets spoke in paradox, because God is not found by those who demand answers, but by those who endure questions long enough to discover that they are already loved. The silence was not proof of his distance, it was proof of his depth. So the return does not happen when heaven finally speaks, it happens when you finally hear. And hearing is not about sound, it is about awareness. There is a music older than time, a song sung before words existed, the song of creation still vibrating through everything made. Silence does not stop that song, it reveals it. The heavens declare, the trees clap, the waters rejoice. And when your soul becomes quiet enough, you find yourself singing with them without even trying. That is revelation. Not new information, but union. The sound of return is the sound of oneness. The soul remembering it was never separate. And when that recognition comes, the world feels transfigured. The same sky, the same soil, the same life but brighter, truer, whole. You walk through it not as one seeking signs, but as one who has found meaning in every breath. The silence remains, but now it is alive, luminous, speaking without sound. It is not the end of the journey, it is the awakening within it. The heart that has learned to hear silence as revelation no longer fears it. It has come home. To hear the still small voice of God is not the privilege of prophets alone. It is the birthright of every soul that dares to become quiet. The whisper that spoke to Elijah still moves through the world, unchanged by centuries, unhindered by noise. It is softer than thought, nearer than breath, steady as light. The still small voice does not compete with chaos. It waits beneath it. It will not force itself through volume or drama. It speaks in the spaces you ignore, the pause between tasks, the sigh before sleep, the quiet awareness that something holy moves beneath all this motion. You do not find it by straining, you find it by surrender. To live attuned to divine quiet is to walk through life listening between the sounds. It is to hear God in the laughter of children and in the silence that follows a farewell. It is to trust that every season, noise and stillness alike belongs to Him. The still small voice speaks differently to everyone. To some it comes as peace that outlasts panic. To others, as conviction that gently redirects. Sometimes it sounds like memory, sometimes like longing, sometimes like the sudden knowing that you are loved. It never argues, it invites, it never condemns, it calls you home. To hear it, you must first unlearn the habit of hurry. The soul must slow until it matches the rhythm of grace. This is why Jesus so often withdrew to lonely places to realign his heart with heaven's quiet. The more he gave to the world, the more he returned to silence, as if drawing breath from eternity. We too are invited into that rhythm. Silence is not the absence of engagement. It is the ground of true action. From silence flows compassion that is not performative, wisdom that is not reactionary, prayer that is not performance. To hear the still small voice is to let love lead instead of fear. You begin to notice how this voice threads through everything. It is in the patient sunrise that waits for no applause, in the way forgiveness softens a heart without fanfare, in the way courage arrives quietly before great change. The more you listen, the more you realize that life itself hums with God's tone. And one day you will understand that this is what all the deserts were for, the outer ones and the inner. Every season of waiting, every unanswered prayer, every quiet night was teaching you the sound of heaven. You were being trained not to depend on sight, but on presence. The wilderness was never punishment, it was tuning. Now you walk differently. You move through the world like one who has heard something too beautiful to forget. You listen more than you speak. You look at others and recognize the same divine breath moving in them. Even the noise of life no longer threatens your peace. You hear through it. The still small voice becomes your compass. When choices confuse you, it is there, steady, patient, unforced. It does not always say where to go. Sometimes it simply says, "Do not be afraid. Keep walking." It teaches you that obedience is not about certainty, but about trust. And when life grows dark again, and it will, you will remember. You will return to the silence that taught you everything. You will rest there until the whisper comes once more. For the voice of God is not seasonal, it is eternal. It is always speaking beneath the noise, always guiding through the quiet, always loving through the pauses. At the end of all things, when history folds into eternity, that still small voice will be the final sound. It will not thunder. It will call your name, and you will know it instantly, not because you finally hear it for the first time, but because it is the same voice that has been with you all along, leading you through the wilderness, shaping your heart through silence, guiding you home. And in that moment, you will answer not with words, but with peace. The journey will not end in silence, it will end in song. But the song will sound like silence perfected, still, sacred, full of light, and eternity will begin again in a whisper.